I went to the United States Air Force Academy between the years of 1963 and 64. At the Academy, something happened, some experiments were run on a number of us cadets, which involved hypnosis and some sort of mind conditioning. Now, whether this has an effect on what happened later, I'm not sure, but the two do seem to be connected because of the a couple of events that happened to me at the Academy. I must also stress that even though I was a member of the class of 67 there, that I did not graduate, I was part of about 186 cadets who left en masse from the Academy. The official news story put out by the Air Force was that we'd been dismissed for cheating on final exams, which we did not do. It was an honor code problem, which we were all honor code members, or committee members, and we disagreed with what the regular Air Force was doing to the cadets. A couple of our friends, fellow cadets, were dismissed on honor code violations for thinking that they could steal something like a piece of candy or something, not pay for it, but not actually doing it. This was the regular Air Force's way of getting rid of some of the cadets that they didn't like because of their base nationality, whether it was Germanic or whether it was a cultural thing or race thing. And so 186 of us protested and said we wouldn't take our final exams if they didn't let those cadets back in. There's a lot more detail to that story. I'm paraphrasing and condensing, but it was later, probably 20 years later, that the Air Force Academy did admit that it was a disciplinary action rather than a cheating scandal. But it took getting a U.S. Senator to investigate it before they tell the truth. So they've admitted to this much, but not to the conditioning that went on to us there at the Academy. We were, those of us that were chosen, not every cadet was chosen, were shown how to read 200 pages a second in flash queuing with a machine that would flash them on a screen in front of us. We were hypnotized quite frequently, and what went on during those sessions we never knew because you just woke up as you were leaving or as your programmer was leaving your room. The only thing that they slipped up on while I was at the Academy was my mathematics teacher and calculus teacher, Captain Eisenman. I was his favorite student because calculus was my forte. And he took me out, or checked me out one Sunday afternoon from the Academy and drove me up on the ledge overlooking the Academy to tell me something. And I remember him starting the conversation, and then the next thing I remember, it's like a fraction of a second later, was he said, "Now that's why these things will happen. You'll understand them later, but not now." And we drove back. To me, it seemed like we'd been there 1 minute and we're leaving. So I don't know what transpired in between there, but obviously I was probably hypnotized or out of it for the time that he was talking. Don't know how they managed to do that, but that's how it seems. Now that was the Academy, and I left with the other 185 cadets. We were dismissed over several weeks during the Christmas break of 63 into January of 64. They got us all out of the Academy before the other cadets got back from their Christmas leave to avoid too much talking between us about what had happened. A few years passed. I went down to Dallas where I lived. They sent me back there, and I was trained at IBM in computing. So I started to have dreams that were quite lucid about Einstein's physics, how gravity worked, how to make a device that looks quite similar to a flying saucer. And these weren't normal dreams because they'd be just before I would get up out of bed in the morning, very early, and it would be like I could have a CAD-CAM system, a 3D CAD-CAM system in my mind, and I could say I want to know about, and an object or an equation would appear before me and dissect itself, and I would be able to see it by just thinking what I wanted. I could take apart the flying saucer or study gravity as a moving waveform in a medium. I could see it just by wanting to. Now I later found out down in Australia, we'll get to that in a minute, what I was referencing, how I was seeing those things. But that's the first sign I had after the Academy that something was locked up in my memory. Now, Captain Eisman did say that later I would understand, that it was very important, but right now I would not understand, but later I would. Now, I assume this is where we're getting. In Dallas, I was working mainly in the computer industry as a programmer, systems analyst. And then when these dreams started happening, I had collected a bit of staff under me at one of the companies I worked for. And we were emergency teams. Like we'd come solve large corporations' computer problems where a disgruntled employee would plant a virus or a bomb or a bandit of some sort in the system before they left the company. We'd come in and find it and solve it. And while I was at this company, which was a conglomerate of 100 corporations in Dallas, I was visited by the FBI, who asked me to work for them undercover there, which they vocally denied for years that they had any people like us, but in the end they admitted they had 700 of us who weren't formally trained agents working for them in industry. And the reason they wanted me to, in essence, spy there in this company was because the owners of the company were doing illegal arms deals in the Middle East. So my job was to find out who they were communicating with and why. This was about a year or two before the Watergate scandal occurred, and my job there terminated when I turned in a report that I believe it was Murray Schottner, and the Dallas area head of the Washington area head of the FBI under Hoover appeared by helicopter there one day and met with the owners of the company. And I turned this report into the FBI in Dallas to my agents, and apparently stirred up a hornet's nest because I had identified this FBI director or area director of Washington as being in Dallas without checking in, and he was part of an internal war in the FBI, pro-Hooverites and anti-Hooverites, and my side, the guys I worked for, were pro-Hoover. They got me out of the company there fairly quickly, but before I left, probably a month or so before this all blew up and the guys came to visit from Washington and I turned in my report, before that happened, I went down to the executive coffee lounge on the floor where I was on the top floor to have coffee one morning, and there wasn't any, so I decided to go down to the general staff canteen downstairs where we feed the 3,000 workers. It was between breaks and there was no one there, so I sat down, got a cup of coffee, and sat in a lunchroom that would take probably 1,000 people, and was having a cup of coffee all by myself at this table, and in walks one of the company executives from one of the life insurance companies we have. Turns out he's an actuarial scientist, or the guy that figured the tables for your life-death statistics. His name was Ted Owanski. And Ted and I got to talking. He came sit right in front of me, I'd never met him, about some of my research at home and into alternate energy, converting thermionic energy into electricity, and into making saucer craft that would defy gravity, a very efficient means of propulsion. Well, Ted Owanski was a European, probably be Polish from the name, and he even smoked his cigarettes, the way they do it between these two fingers and they like that. And he was old enough to have been there during World War II. He told me after the discussion progressed along, he said, "Look, I want you to give a friend of mine a call." And I said, "About what?" And he said, "Oh, he'd be interested in this kind of stuff you're talking about." So I said, "Well, yeah, sure, I'll do that." And sometime, I wasn't really too concerned about that because my real world job there and the FBI jobs keep me fairly occupied. And he said, "Here's the number." His name is Dr. James R. Maxfield Radiation Research Clinic down the street here in Dallas. So I filed it in my pocket and forgot it. Well, a month went by and things were getting fairly tense with the FBI thing I was doing, and I found myself down in the lunchroom again, having a cup of coffee in the morning, and it was empty, and plowed me down if this guy didn't show up again, this Owanski. So he comes and he wins his way through all the tables that are empty, sits himself down in front of me and says, "Hi." Great, good, kind of like, "What do you want?" And he said, "Notice you haven't gone to see my friend Jim Maxfield." And I said, "No, I've been a little bit busy actually." And he said, "I'll make an appointment for you this afternoon at 3 o'clock. You go see him right now." I said, "I really haven't got time." He said, "Yes, you do. You must see him this afternoon." So by this time I wasn't sure who this guy was working for, and so I wasn't sure whether he was setting me up for some unhappiness or not. So I said fine, and come 2:45 or so, I climbed in my car and drove down, I think it was Oaklawn, I can't remember where the office is now, I think it was Oaklawn Avenue in Dallas, and I drove up to the place. There were no cars out in front, single-story building, door ajar. So I opened it very carefully, and it kind of, like in the horror movies, it creaked open a bit, and I looked down the hallway, and it's all dark, no lights inside. There doesn't appear to be any staff or anything in this research clinic. So I said, hello, is anybody there? Nothing. So I walked very carefully and watched every door on the left and right and behind me as I went through, in case it was some kind of a setup to knock me over the head. And I got all the way to the middle. There was a nurse's station, no one there, and nothing running. And I thought, boy, I'm leaving this joint. And then all of a sudden, this nurse comes out the back, out the side door, and says, "Oh, hi, who are you here to see?" I said, "Well, Dr. Maxfield." "So yes, Jim's expecting you. Just hold on just a second. He'll be right here." Double doors now open up, and this big, tall Texas guy comes out, short cropped hair, big cigar, cowboy boots, long white robe, or with the doctor's coat, and he introduced himself, and I said, "Well, I'm Stan Deyo." And he said, "Oh yeah, I know who you are. I've been expecting you. Come on in the office." So we go into his office there, right across from the nurse's station, and I sit down, and I realize this guy. I mean, I can see on the wall he's got degrees in everything worth having, and he's a very bright fellow. There are photographs of him and all kinds of notables and physicists on the wall. And I said, I really don't understand why I'm here, but Ted Owanski, and he said, "Yeah, I know Ted, told me I ought to talk to you today, rather urgently." And he said, "Why don't you start by telling me what you're doing?" I says, "Oh, well, I work in the computer industry, and I'm doing this and that." And he said, No. What you're doing at home in your laboratory." I said, "Oh, that." So now here you are, you're a guy without degrees, that's me, and I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, I'm talking to one of the guys that helped, Edward Teller build a hydrogen bomb. And I'm a nothing compared to this guy. And he's asked me what I'm doing, and I'm working on anti-gravity, and I know that you don't talk those kind of words to these kind of people. So I said, "Well, sir, I've been working on a theory about combining gravitational electromagnetic fields to force, to actually make," and he said, Stop. He said, "Anti-gravity, you're working on anti-gravity, we know that. Now, tell me what you're doing." And I said, I am. I'm working." He says, "Yeah." I said, well, here's how I was doing it." He listened, and I was explaining how I was working with toroidal coils and how I made an air model, and he said, "Well, boy," he said, "we've done over 50 projects like this since the mid-50s. I said, "We?" He said, "Oh, Dr. Teller and I, our group, we've known about this for some time. Why don't you work for us?" And I said, "Well, it sounded like a great idea. I mean, who's us, and where do we work?" He said, "Well, we think the place for you to finish your work would be in Australia." And I thought, "Well, Australia, that's down there somewhere. That's a long way away." "Yes, well, I guess you'd have enough desert to test things." He says, "Yep, sure do." And then he took me up around the wall, and he says, "Look, see, that's me and Dr. Teller, my first trip, or his first trip, Maxwell's first trip, onto the ice cap." He said they have a little ceremony they give you in the submarine when you go to the ice cap down there to the base, at the South Pole. And I said, "Yes, well, that's very interesting. I'm completely overwhelmed at the moment." And he says, "Now, we'll send you down to Australia." I said, "Oh, look, no, wait a minute. I said, "Look, I've got, family and house and shares and stock market. I'm kind of, settled here." And he says, "Well, how much does it take to get you out of the share market and, your house and stuff? Write a number on a piece of paper there, we'll fix it up." And I said, well, I don't have the qualifications that you'll need to go down there, I mean, I don't have any degrees." "Yeah, I know all that. He said, "We'll send you down there, you'll become an electrical engineer on our books." And he picked up the phone, rang the Australian consulate in San Francisco, and said, "This is Jim Maxfield." Says, "Bob Gray there?" "Yeah, all right, well, look, tell him Jim rang and tell him I've got another one of Maxfield's boys." And, that was it. And a few weeks passed. I had some phone calls from this guy, and a lady from the consulate rang and flew out to see me there in Dallas, and set up an appointment to interview me after I'd done all the medicals she had to do, my family had. And a couple of my friends at the office where I worked in the computer thing, I told them, "Look, guys, you're not going to believe this, but I'm going to go down to Australia to work." And they said, "Oh, gee, we'd like to go. That sounds like a great place, I said, "Well, there's a lady coming up from the consulate." Still pretty naive I was. I said, "Look, file your applications and get the interview, and maybe you can go with me." So they did, and they were, one of them was a life insurance company executive, and they had a couple of dollars behind them. And so anyway, we all went up to the hotel room. She booked an appointment for them and made us wait outside, and they went first. And one by one, they went in and they came out, and they went, "No, I couldn't qualify. They're tough. We can't get into Australia." And I thought, "Oh, well, what am I doing here?" So then this lady calls me in, and the wife at the time, and we go in and sit down and talk to her. And she says, "Well, what would you like to do in Australia?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to be working for Dr. Maxfield. And she said, well, what are we going to call you? And I said, well, a computer programmer or something like that. No. I think he said we need electrical engineers on. Yeah, you're an electrical engineer this week, and here's your tickets. And there was no problem. It was just kind of a shoe. And the other guys weren't supposed to be there. And so, all right, it was a royal red carpet ride to Australia. Well, if you're reasonably normal, you kind of start to wonder, all this is happening to you and you really haven't earned it, what's going on? So I sold my house, I carried papers around, I packed the house up and had garage sales, sold off everything we weren't taking, and the rest I put in about 25 boxes in the living room, took the key, took it over to my dad, and I said, Dad, look, next Sunday, a couple of days from now, I'm going to be on a plane to Australia with a family. And it was been kept fairly secret up to that point. And I said, I want you to mail these boxes to me when I get there. I'll tell you where when I find out. And but I'm going to leave, a week earlier what my tickets say. And the reason for that is that I wanted to, the FBI thing had kind of blown up. So I didn't know who to trust, so I left a week early, just went out for a Sunday drive, even played the game in the house where I said to the wife, look, why don't we take a drive out, today to White Rock Lake? And so we just diverted over to Love Field and climbed on the plane and we're gone. Handed the keys of my car over to my brother and said, sure, see you around. Got to Australia without the plane blowing up, thinking I was pretty fortunate, and was in Sydney at the airport there, and it was early in the morning or late in the night, however you want to look at it. It was dark, and there weren't any people in the airport. It was still pretty country townish. And this was back in 1971 in September, around the 19th of September. And then I was there in the airport without anybody around. I thought, well, I've got to kill 6 hours till the flight will take me on down to Melbourne. Well, an airline pilot came walking by and he said, "G'day, mate." And I said, "Oh, howdy, And he said, "What are you doing?" I told him, "We're sitting around here waiting with these 2 kids till we can take the flight down to Melbourne." He said, "Oh, look, what airline are you with?" And it was with a competing airline. He said, "Oh, look, that's all right. I'll have them change your ticket across. Come on with me. I'm fixing to go down now. Fly down with us," which is quite friendly. So we thought, well, this will be a good dodge. Nobody knows we're on that flight. That'll be fine. So we took the flight down to Melbourne, dived into a hostel, which is like a hotel there for very cheapy dollars. And I had gotten one name of a mutual friend who was an Australian working for the same company I'd been working for in Dallas. And that one name I rang on the phone on a Sunday morning, I think it was, and I said to him, "Look, I'm here, Charlie, and you don't know me, but we have a mutual friend, and we need a bit of help." And so this fellow got me a car and a house and stuff, rent and things like that, and set me up, and I went off to get some work. I decided that I wasn't going to work for any of these guys, that it was all too exotic, there was something amiss there. So for 6 months I worked, I got a job immediately, was given my selection of 3 companies to work for, and I went to work for Caterpillar and William Adams Steel, which was a joint venture there, as a senior systems analyst. And the workload was so, minor. I mean, everybody works very slow down there, and so I had all my work done by about 10 or 11 in the morning and stacked up and had time on my hands. So I told my secretary, I said, "Look, can you print some papers and bind some books and stuff if I write some reports?" She said, "Oh, yeah." So I started writing and designing the craft I've been working on back in the States, because I had plenty of time on my hands at the office. I finally made a breakthrough in understanding something about the gravitic craft, so I wrote a letter to Dr. Maxfield, airmailed it to him, and I got an airmail letter shot straight back, which I have photocopied and put in the back of the book that I eventually wrote called The Cosmic Conspiracy. In that letter, he said, "Look, we want you to talk to Dr. Tom Keeble at the Aeronautical Research Labs there in Melbourne. First, we want you to contact the prominent man in your area," which was some kind of a code word for, their guy. His name was Sir John Williams. Sir John had been knighted by the Queen for his work during World War II to salvage gold from sunken ship off the coast of New Zealand. And he was the chief executive officer for Adelaide Steamship and Salvage there in Adelaide, and his office was in Melbourne. He was definitely an ex-naval man. His bearing was quite good. At the time I met him, he was in his 70s, maybe late 70s. But anyway, I did as Dr. Maxfield told in those 2 letters. I rang up Sir John's home and I said, "Sir John, this is Stan Deyo, you don't know me. He said, oh, yes, I do. Boy, I've been waiting for you for 6 or 7 months. You're late getting here. And I thought, wow. And I said, oh, well, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. And I'd skipped my last briefing with Maxwell, and then when I left a week early, I just didn't trust anybody at that time and left. So Sir John says, look, we'll meet, I'll have my driver pick you up at the train station in Melbourne, coming in from the suburbs, and we'll have lunch. And that's how that started. And I went in on the train, and sure enough, a guy looking, very stocky guy, a judo karate type guy, was waiting there for me at the airport in a Mercedes, and put me in the back seat, and Sir John was there, and we drove off to what's called the Melbourne Club, which is a private club there in Melbourne, run by the leading Conservative Party members, or like the Liberal Party is what they call it there, but it'd be like something like the Republican Party here in America. And the leading lights of that own that club and run it, and you don't get in it unless you're kind of born in it. It's a very exclusive power elite club in Victoria, in fact in Australia, as I was later to find out. Anyway, we went to lunch, and we had Sir Henry Somerset, who was one of the 9 chancellors of the board of directors for the Commonwealth Scientific Investigative and Research Organization, CSIRO. We talked for a while. We had another fellow at the table, an English professor from Tasmania. I looked around the room. Most of the guys were cotton tops, white-haired gentlemen, all very well heeled. After lunch, we wandered into the brandy and port room, and the stewards came in with things on little silver platters and served us. And I said to Sir John, I said, boy, this is a nice place. And he says, well, we're going to be sure that you're properly assimilated into business and society here for your work. And Sir Henry, who was there at the table, had some interest in gold mines in Ballarat, and which was only about 60 miles from there. And our relationship started. I was to write a report giving them detailed explanation of everyone I had talked to in the States about what I was doing, who I had met along the way, and how I got there, and what I wanted to do. So I had to basically write a term paper for them on that, and include the design of my craft. So it took me a month or so to do that, and I rang him back and brought the report in by hand, and was sitting in the Melbourne Club with him where we had lunch, and he was due to fly off to Jakarta that day later, and he was going to have his people, his science people on the aircraft, to have a look at my paper. So he was thumbing through my paper, and we'd had lunch, and we were sipping port, and everything was very relaxed, and I was watching as he flipped through my paper on electrokinetic propulsion, and at the last I had the finished diagram of what the craft would look like, cut away. And as he turned to that page, he lost his composure and went, ah! His jaw dropped, and he said, can I have a copy of this? I said, well, that is your copy to take. He said, yes, of course. Right. Well, we'll see you when I get back. And so he left, and I submitted that paper, that same paper, as instructed, to the head of the Aeronautical Research Lab there in Fisherman's Bend at Melbourne. The director's name was Tom Keeble, Dr. Tom Keeble. I submitted it, let's say, by mail, like one day, like a Monday or Tuesday of the week. 2 days later, I'm at home in the evening with my family, and my wife needs something from the corner milk bar, which is like a convenience store, a small family-owned convenience store. So I went down. It was dark, and I was standing in line. There were several other people getting their smokes and whatever, and I'm standing there in line waiting to get my stuff, and a voice behind me, standing real close to me, a guy standing real close, and he says, don't turn around. But I know you submitted something to the Aeronautical Research Labs yesterday, and I'll talk with you about it outside, but don't turn around and look at me. So I'm thinking, I was just getting some stuff here, bread and smokes and things. This is really quite extraordinary. So I did as he said, and I got my stuff and walked out. Didn't see anybody out there for a second. I started to walk home, and he just kind of joined me from the shadows there. He said, I'm Dr. David Warren. I live across the street from you, right across the street. I said, oh, how did you know that I turned in a paper? He said, well, for 13 years I worked for the CSIRO, the Aeronautical Research Labs, the Aeronautical Research Labs, as their Chief Scientific Investigative Officer. And your proposal was put on my desk. I got to look at it for maybe an hour, before the director, Dr. Keeble, came in and said to me, David, look, we're going to take this one away from you. Consider it classified above you and don't reference it any longer. He said, in 13 years, they've never done that to me. I've never been insulted like that. He said, I can't ask you for a copy of the paper. I cannot talk to you. But, you know, I certainly would like to know what it's all about. And I said, well, what would happen if one appeared in your mailbox? I've got a photocopy across. And he said, well, gee, I couldn't help that now, could I? So here was a man that had been taken away from because he wasn't in the in crowd inside the ARL. I don't know why. Anyway, I did give him the copy later, the next couple of days. I was called in for a meeting to the Aeronautical Research Labs by the director and with 3 other scientists. One of them was Bill Schofield, who is today the current director of the Aeronautical Research Labs under the Defense Standards Group there. They told me about flying saucer tests that they had filmed, about flying saucers that perhaps weren't ours that they had filmed and had on file at the RAAF Air Force Base at Sale in Victoria, S-A-L-E, Victoria. While I was sitting in that room talking to them, they said, all right, how'd you get here? Where'd you get your training? And I said to them, I'd been to the Air Force Academy. And they said, ah. And they looked at each other like they knew something I didn't. I said, yes, well, I went through some kind of training there. It was like hypnosis. And they said, ah, yes, we always wanted to meet one of you chaps. I said, one of those chaps, all right, explain. They said, well, we'd heard that they were tuning mines, like radios, that you could eavesdrop on other scientists' work, even in other countries. If you concentrated on a subject, you could access that database of knowledge. I said, well, I'd never seen anybody's mine. They said, no, you wouldn't. The way they were doing it was that you could access the data without knowing who it belonged to, and you would hear in your mind or see in your mind what they're doing. I said, well, I suppose that explains it. And they said, well, the only trouble is a lot of the guys died. They suicided. And I said, well, I heard about a couple of them at the academy that did, but you know, I just figured that was normal stress that happens there. And he said, well, no, a few of them just went tropo, or they went crazy when it got too much for them. I said, well, I can understand, I suppose, because it made you very tired, and it take you 2 or 3 days, you get dark circles under your eyes to sleep off whatever it was they filed into your mind. And I said, well, all right, show me these videotapes and films that you've got of the UFOs. And they all said, oh, gee, we couldn't do that, that's classified. And as they said that, they motioned back behind them to a bookshelf and said, you know, maybe. They mimed with their mouth, maybe, so that you couldn't be heard by, you know, a microphone in the bookcase at the ARL there. And then immediately after that, they said, oh, by the way, did ASIO contact you when you came into the country? And I was new to the country, I'd never heard of ASIO. Well, that's the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, which the CIA had trained. I mean, we set up that thing, I found out later. I said, no, I wasn't contacted by them, and they kind of went wink, wink, and pointed to the bookshelf again. That's ASIO, their own government bugging it, and they weren't wanting their own government security people to know what we were talking about. So then the plot starts to form. You see, well, we're talking here at a government institutional level there. They're doing something that is above or outside their own government. Now, I thought that very strange, but yet they knew about what I'd been through. Well, a few weeks passed, months, and Sir John asked to send my report back. He said, I want you to write this again, and this time leave out some of your observations about what we should do with the technology. I was getting pretty perturbed when I found out how much other technology had been done by other fellows, some a lot better than my own. I have to admit, they outshone me a great deal in the propulsion systems. And I thought, look at all the poverty in the world, look at all the people starving. We could take these craft, we could be across the ocean in an hour or less, and take feed and all kinds of stuff. I mean, we can really help the world. And we can cut down a lot of the pollution. I was thinking, wow, we've got to show people this. Because I didn't understand the bigger game plan on the global thing, which we can talk about later, I had an argument with him, a very serious argument with Sir John. And the end of the argument kind of went like, well, I wrote another paper, and he said, you've still done it wrong. You've mentioned these things, made drawn opinions about what we should do with it. And he humped off, and the driver took me back to the train station. I went home. A few weeks went past, and out in the front porch of my house, a special delivery courier delivered a box. And in that box were all my original papers that I filed with him, all of our communications and correspondence, and a little nice see you around card on top from Sir John. My friends and I feel that there's no longer any purpose in us working together. You know, in essence, you're sacked, fired. So that was it, and no further contact. And I thought, well, that was the end of it. Then one of his lackeys that owned an insurance company there, I think it might have been something like Eagle Insurance or something in Melbourne. Anyway, I can't tar and feather, I can't remember. But anyway, this fellow came and bumped into me at my favorite watering hole there at lunch in Melbourne and said, look, you know, I've been talking to one of your friends here, and apparently you've got some stuff you'd like to research and develop. You know, I've got friends that'd like to invest in that. I said, oh, well, gee, that sounds great. And so they set up a meeting, and this meeting with all their investors is behind the house of the former Prime Minister. His backyard just came into this little room, Sir Robert Menzies' backyard. And we sat in there and discussed propulsion and energy. And they said, well, all right, now we want you to, Dutch Oil are part of our backers, we want you to make a formal presentation to their people in another building next week. However, we will get back in touch with Dr. Maxfield in Dallas and just confirm a couple of things. Well, I was after funding then. They were going to give it to me. I was expecting to present a paper to these folks and, you know, have them say rubbish or have them say great stuff, we'll do it. Before the meeting took place, I got a call from this insurance guy and the other fellow that were arranging all these people, and they said, look, we don't need to have the meeting now, we've decided that we'll underwrite it. Great stuff, bright fellow, wonderful. What we're going to do now, we ask you to be very secretive about this, tell no one where we're going to send you and who's doing it, and we want you to finish your work. We understand that that energy conversion thing needs a long antenna. Why don't you put that antenna instead of up, put it down in a shaft? And I said, well, I never thought about it, I guess it'd work. Where would you get a 3,000 or 4,000 foot shaft? He said, we have one. Sir Henry has one out in the goldfields out at Ballarat. Ah, okay. And I said, well, yeah, but you know, the instrument package that I'm designing has to be on the bottom of the thing. We know you can have a laboratory, because those old mines and stuff have a lot of room, and you can put a laboratory down there, and you can put all your equipment down there. Nobody will ever know what we're doing. But don't tell anybody where you're going. So the penny started to drop that I was fixing to end up at the bottom of a 3,000 or 4,000 foot mine shaft with a very narrow exit and entry, and probably disappear in the sunset under a lot of rock. So I said, well, gee, that's very good. That's really special. I like it. Let's do it. Finished lunch, immediately went around making preparations to disappear. And I did disappear. I will not discuss on camera how I did it, in case I have to use it again, but I did manage to elude them for 6 months in Australia and have everybody looking for me, all the intelligence agencies for sure. I did have help from a former Australian intelligence officer from World War II that I bumped into in a very odd place, which really was a coincidence. And I asked him how one disappears, and said the best thing we ever found was blah, 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 and he was right. And so I was able to, in essence, hide for 6 months while I put together a plan for defense to keep them from killing me. And that plan eventually was to come out of the city, out of the bush into the cities, to Perth, Australia, where I would write my story down if I could find someone to do it, and publish it, and I would have insurance. I would tell enough that I'd name names and keep them off my back, but not enough to make it where they'd have to kind of do me because I'd told the whole story. Well, I couldn't find anybody who was interested when I got to Perth, and because they weren't really interested in anything else other than beer and the football. But I decided to start working as a contractor there. That's the only work I could get because I couldn't use my passport to identify myself at that time. I worked under a false name I just adopted of Noah Davidson at the time. I started to make a bit of money in the contracting, putting in electrolytic chlorinators in pools, and went into a joint business with another fellow into calculator imports and camera sales in Perth, and started another company, and started to wear suits and shave the beard and disguise back a bit and be normal. And one day, as fate would have it, a fellow was at the tip, the garbage dump. The same day I was throwing away a big chest, or what do you call it, like a linen, like a closet. Down there, a lot of the houses don't have walk-in closets. They have these furniture pieces that you open up and hang your suits and jeans and stuff. And anyway, I had one of these. I had too many of them in the house that I was renting, so I was going to throw one of them away. I had it in the back of the old pickup, and I was going to drop it out in the tip. Well, as I started to drop it out, the car behind me, the guy runs out and says, "Oh, wait. He says, are you going to throw that out?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Don't let it hit the ground." I said, "Well, okay, why?" He said, "Oh, it's tip rules." I said, "Tip rules?" And he said, "Yeah." He says, "You know, if you let any of the stuff you're throwing away actually touch the garbage tip, the garbos have a license, and it's theirs, and they can keep it or sell it or whatever." He said, "I want that." I said, "Well, fine, all right, tell me where you're going, I'll drive it there." And he turned out to be an off-duty policeman. And he said, "Look, I just live around here." We started to pack up and go. Well, the garbos with the large Caterpillar, what was a D9, it was a big mover, was sitting there, and he said, "Hey, you can't do that. That belongs to us garbos." And the policeman's, "Oh, yes, I can. It never hit the ground." And so the guy starts running his tractor and his blade right toward the cop's car, and he's going to push his car off into the tip. Because it's a civilian car, he didn't know he was a policeman. So the guy whips out his thing, and he says, "Stop. I'm taking that." And so there was a little altercation, and finally the policeman won, and we went off. The crowd had gathered. One of the members of the crowd there turns out to be a TV producer for the local television station. They were making a documentary on UFOs. Well, I didn't know that. We got over to the cop's house, having a cup of coffee and tea and crumpets and whatever. Everybody talking about how neat it was to have a fight at the garbage tip. And we got talking flying saucers and UFOs, my favorite subject. And so I start talking to these people, and this guy had come along from the tip, this producer fellow. He says, "Can I have your phone number?" And so he just appeared one day, a couple days later, over at my house and said, "Look, I've talked to the director of our new production here, and we'd like to have you appear on our show." So that started then. That got me a publisher. I wrote as much as I could in that book, in the Cosmic Conspiracy, without revealing everything. It was part of my extra insurance. And it worked. I found a publisher that eventually said it was too hard in Melbourne. I took it back, and I self-published the book, and have now sold it in 22 countries and 4 languages, English, Greek, French, and German. And the book has certainly gone well since 1978. It's probably in its 14th or 15th printing. Well over 250,000 something copies now. So during that time, I was visited occasionally by former intelligence agents who had been either with the project from the MI6 division of British intelligence in the Middle East and in Europe after the war, or from Australian members. There were two of those, one MI6 fellow, and the Russians. Although the Russians were involved, I don't know that I ever spent much time with any of their agents talking about that. I did meet one KGB officer in Adelaide who had memorized the Nuremberg trials page by page and could quote from memory. Bright fellow. From the time that I walked out of their offices and had the argument with Sir John and was dismissed, I never ever worked for the group again. I did investigate, and any time that I had an opportunity to talk with intelligence officers who had been involved in the project in some way, I gleaned information where I could. When I arrived there in Perth in 74 and then eventually in 78 wrote and published The Cosmic Conspiracy, in that intervening time, 74 to 78, I met some police officers there in Perth. And in Australia, they have what they call the Commonwealth Intelligence Bureau, the CIB, which is sort of like an FBI, a lower standard of it, but it's a national police force across Australia. But each state has a state branch of the ASIO and of the CIB. My branch out there in Perth, in West Australia, it was treated kind of like the stepchild West Australia was of Australia, because it's so far away from all the other main cities. Probably in miles, 2,000 miles away from the main coastal cities on the eastern coast of Australia. Well, anyway, I made friends with a CIB officer there that there's no point in naming him, but he did say that they were aware of my situation, and as long as I stayed in WA, where they were of similar mind to my own on this issue, that I was safe. But if I went back to the eastern states, that they couldn't guarantee my safety because each state was run by a different clique of individuals in the CIB and the AGO offices. So I determined it was probably a good idea to stay in Perth and live and work for a while, in fact many years eventually. Around that time, probably within a year or two of that time, I was approached by an industrialist, a British industrialist in Perth by the name of Paul Pearson. He was connected to a back east, in the Australia back east group of industrialists, again British and Australian mix, and knew my story before I even got there. He had me come to a meeting with himself, his solicitors, lawyers, attorneys, and those of the richest man in the state who owned the iron ore of Lang Hancock, of Hancock and Wright Enterprises. They reserved an entire restaurant at the hotel there in Perth, the Paddington I think it was called at the time, during the afternoon. And they would not let anyone, staff or anyone close enough to hear what we were saying. They just cordoned off the chairs and got everybody out, and we sat at a table and had lunch, and they made their pitch. Now this is an extraordinary thing that they told me, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly why they did this, but they said, if you will be quiet, but this is before I actually published the book, if you will be quiet and go with us, we will give you what you need. We'll give you engineering staff. You can develop your ideas north of here. We have plenty of mining sites that we can just build up for whatever you want. If you need 60 engineers, you've got them. But just don't rock the boat. Don't you understand what this is all about? And I said, well, I've got half an idea. I think this is a global thing we're looking at, not one country, but a global organization. He said, yes. And I said, if I'm not mistaken, you will have to have a dictator over this new type of government you're going to set up. And he said, yes. And I said, well, pardon me for asking, there's one big problem with a dictator. How do you, as a group, control this fellow? How do you turn him off when he's done what you want him to do? We're working on that. We haven't quite solved that yet. And he said, you're here in Australia. If you go with us, this could be yours, the whole country. I said, I beg your pardon? He said, he's going to have people working in each area. I said, well, that's really pretty special. Tell you what, guys, when you figure out how you're going to control that fellow, that dictator, let me know. Then we'll talk again. And this is talking, I was very poor at the time because I'd had to leave everything when I ran. And, you know, I was working my way back up into having where I could buy a car and stuff like that. And so their offer was quite lucrative. And the fact that I might be, you know, gee, a mini dictator, that was even more fun. But it astounded me. It was another piece to the puzzle that would form into a more accurate picture many years later. After 78, or right around 78, actually, so I was about to publish the Cosmic Conspiracy book, but I hadn't finished it yet. It was, you know, being assembled and ready for printing. I was invited across Australia by a group of businessmen in Queensland. That's be like going from San Diego, California, over to New York City. They provided a first-class ticket for me to fly across. They wanted me to give a public lecture on all the stuff that I was gathering for the book. A lot of them were Christian businessmen, very straight shooters, so I didn't have any trouble with that. And around that time I'd become a Christian myself, and so I thought, right, good thing to do. So I flew over, I didn't have any trouble. When I landed in Queensland, there were men in white shirts and ties and kind of doeskin leather jackets who were there at the airport to kind of stand beside to be sure that nothing bothered me. Turns out later the governor, or the premier of the state they call him there, but the governor Bjelke Peterson, had supplied me with bodyguards to be sure that nothing happened in his state while I was there. You didn't hear about this here in the United States, but in that country, in Australia, from that moment forward for probably 5 or 6 years, there probably wasn't an adult person there that didn't know my name because of the furor that did develop. But I had a book that was 10 times over a bestseller in Australia. Here it would have been a million seller in this country, but we couldn't get it released here. This lecture that I went to do was at Cooperoo High School, and we put, I don't know, maybe 800 or 1,000 people in the audience there. And I started lecturing Saturday morning, took a lunch break, lectured till the evening, Sunday morning to the lunch break, and to the evening. So I lectured for probably 20 hours there. There was a crowd. They set up underneath the stage in a little recording area, and they had back-to-back, wall-to-wall Sony duplicators going, and people at the lecture, at the end of the lecture, could pay their $5 or $10 or whatever and get complete copies of what was said. And I did basically what we're doing here, but I told a lot of other things as far as, hearsay and conjecture, and this is how the puzzle fits together. What we're doing here is what I've actually experienced or done, so this is, straight testimony to start with. At this lecture, there was some guy heckling me in the front row about the end of the first day, and he was getting fairly vocal. He was about 3 or 4 rows back from the stage. And he stood up and he really started to shake his fist and get at me. He was interrupting the entire lecture, talking about the UFO cover-up and all this kind of stuff and our technological suppression. Well, when he became very vocal and started shaking his fist, about 4 guys in those leather coats just stood up. And they just kind of came in from both sides of the aisle, kind of, excuse me, sideways to him. They leaned into his ear like this and said something. And whatever they said, he straightened right up like a board. And as they moved sideways, he moved with them. And they took him out, and I never saw him again. That was the Premier's boys being sure that I wasn't bothered. And the Premier did eventually invite me back over, and we had a private conference where we talked about the Governor General, Sir Solomon Cohen's involvement in this global conspiracy. Now, just as an aside, I really am sorry that Sir Jockey Peterson never got to be Prime Minister of Australia, because he would have possibly done what we are doing here and would have turned it around. Because we knew that there was a foreign agency, a multinational agency, that had been undermining a lot of countries, including the United States, and taking minds like myself and technology that was developed and taking it away to this new group, or the secret group that they've got. Anyway, as I say, the Governor, or the Premier, did take care of me at that lecture, and while I was in his city. Now, on the Sunday night, I was very, very tired after 20 hours of lecture, and I nearly lost my voice. And I thanked everybody for coming, and they were just a wonderful audience. And I went back behind stage, and they were at the door wanting to talk, a line of questions, so we let them in. And one question after another, and I'd be polite and answer it, and then they'd go. And it's dark outside, I'm thinking, please, let's just go home and sleep. I noticed a guy in the line carrying kind of a shopping bag with handles, and he was smallish build, very thin, had pointy black shoes on, very oily skin, and kind of sharp features on his nose. It was a very prominent, sharp-featured nose. Well, because we'd had the trouble, he had his hand put it down in that paper bag, and I thought that he might be reaching for a knife or a gun, because he would get within 2 or 3 people of me, and he'd see more people behind him, excuse himself to the end of the line. So I couldn't get to any of my security people because I was behind stage, and they were all out clearing everybody out of the auditorium. So finally, he was the last one left, and he came up to me and he reached down in the paper bag, says, "I've got something to show you." And I thought, right. So I got ready to try to duck or whatever, and he pulls out this probably inch-thick sheaf of papers, photocopies and news articles and stuff, and some Polaroid photographs. And he lays the Polaroid photographs in his hand like this. He says, "Have a look." And so I look at these Polaroid photographs, and they're an assembly area of electrogravitic saucer craft, taken apart. They've been out there working on them in this huge work area, probably a warm country from the looks of the building walls. They weren't insulated. And I looked at that, and I said, "Well, what are you showing me?" He says, "We think you know." And I said, "We?" He says, "Yes." And then he handed me the sheaf of papers. He said, "Thumb through there. This is you." And I thumbed through there, and there were quotes of stuff, articles about things I had said. I'd never even been to Canada. These were from Canadian papers, American papers, things I talked about on this, all collected. Everything I'd probably ever said in a bathroom was all in this thing, And I said, "Where did this come from?" He said, "You realize that what you were telling these people out there is an antique?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, what are you looking at?" I said, "Well, that's an electrogravitic craft." He said, "Well, that's the modern one." I said, "I don't suppose you let me take a photocopy." He said, "You've got to be kidding." So I said, "Well, let me just look at it a bit longer." So I memorized as much as I could of the photograph, the field coil arrangements, and the big wide copper bars that were about probably half-inch thick, and these were wound around a donut type former with a little hoop in the middle, and that was the main drive field. And then there was another coil wrapped at right angles to that, so that we had wrapping flat bar coils like this around a donut. And then they got skinny at the thing and went over the doorway or something. And they told me about the little side coils, the A and B coils that had they're polarity sensitive. They have to be marked when they're in the assembly area, because if you reverse the polarity of one of them when they fire it up, it creates a fireball and vaporizes the entire craft. And so anyway, I was suitably impressed with all this, and so I said, well, look, what's inside the former? He said, oh, well, here's another photograph, and inside it showed me a square section of the former, and it was hollow, and it was only insulation and those fuel coils wrapped around it. And I said, well, wow, what kind of a metal have you got in there for an inductor, a magnetic conductor? And he said, oh, it's a moon metal. And I said, well, gee, and I'm thinking to myself, if I just grab those photos and stuff and run, he can't stop me. And he must have sensed that, because he just went like that with stuff and shot out the back door. And I went running after him. I called security. I yelled, and they didn't get there in time. And I saw him in a black limousine driving off. His driver was waiting for him. Never saw him again. Never heard from him again. But that was, I understood what I was looking at. Somebody was out there watching me. And as I tell you, I'd never been to Canada, these other countries where they had the news stories on me and other data they collected on me. So obviously whoever it was had intelligence connections. He did not threaten me with death or anything else. He just said, we thought it was time that you saw the new model. So there you have it. I'm just trying to remember after that. Oh, probably 5, 6 years after that, maybe even 7. Oh, that'd be 83. Yeah. I had a friend. We were working on developing a marine version of the saucer craft, an aircraft that I'd first developed, which wasn't electrogravitic. It was purely an entrainment or asymmetric propulsion device, which I can explain later. Anyway, I was at my friend's factory near Perth, and we were experimenting over several weeks, making these things go in the water so that they would be rapid, leave no wake in the water, and no bow wave, and pretty exotic marine craft. And I wanted to build it so I could make one and make a couple of dollars. Well, a guy that supplied him some of the supplies he needed in his boat building industry, a wholesaler, happened to come into my friend Ken's office one day, and a copy of my Cosmic Conspiracy book was laying on the table. And of course the front cover of the book has flying saucers on it with electric field glows around them. The guy looked at it, picked it up. Whose book is this? A friend of mine. Well, he says, well, he's got it right. And so my friend Kim says, oh, yeah. You know something about it? Might tell you someday. So Kim told me about this guy. He says, is he bull dust? He says, no, he's a bright fellow. So it took us probably 4 or 5 months to make a deal with this guy, to meet in a particular place and have him tell us what he was involved in. Now, here is where I will tell you what I heard from the man. It is hearsay. There is no point in telling you this guy's name, because he swore that if we ever identified him, he would kill us and our families before they got him, because they would kill him. They, being this group we're talking about, the Sir John's and Sir Henry's, this world group. He was attached out of a European intelligence organization after World War II. And he was in a position of lower scientific value or engineering value in the organization, but was taken into an underground bunker that was left over from Hitler stuff, where they set up the initial test after World War II for these electric dishes. And they would use the railways underground, long rail tracks, and they would put a rail sled up and one of these 4-ton saucer lids, and the weight of it was really the transformers in those days. And he said, I could look down the track from the left like this as they fired it up, and before I could turn my head like this as quick as I could to the impact area where it was breaking, he said it would go glow, and a 4-ton device would impact down the hallway, or down the trackway. He said I was later transferred to bases in Norway on the Norwegian-Russian border at the NATO base there, underground. And he said, and in England, he said I was at a test in England, he said, where one of the craft we were making, it was being tested by the pilots, sat in a cradle. The pilots got in, and he said they started to fire it. He said what happens is it kind of started to glow a bit, and then it lifted up very slowly out of the cradle, and then it did a very slow rock like this. And then he said, as quick as I could raise my head, poof, it was way up beyond the clouds, and it left circular rainbows behind it in the air as it disappeared. He said, I stood there for a few minutes, and it came back right over the thing just as fast as it could, and stopped right over the top of the cradle and landed. He said, we did recover an alien craft offshore in England. The whole village had to be taken into confidence and debriefed, and we kept one of the fellows alive, the little fellows, for several years there. It broke in half offshore, and the survivors were taken from that wreck offshore in England. And that's the end of that piece of hearsay. I won't tell you the guy's name because there are other people whose lives are at risk here. There are some incidents now that I would like to relate that occurred around me in Australia and perhaps in America, as I will tell you later, which are hearsay from close friends of mine or agents who work for various governments. So from here on, this is hearsay from sources that I do fairly well trust, though. In Perth, when I was there, probably around 1985-ish, 86, we checked the public records there. A newspaper report came out from the Perth newspaper that day, the West Australian, that said that there had been a fire inside ASIO headquarters there in Perth. This fire was the result of apparently an attempted break-in to their headquarters. Well, I read the report like everyone else in the newspaper and thought, oh gee, that's neat. The secret guy, somebody tried to break in and fire at. Put the paper down, went on about my business. Later that day, I got a phone call from a man that, we'll just call him the karate guy. Used to be the bodyguard, or one of the bodyguards for the Prime Minister of Japan when he was in Australia and traveling in the region. He was an Australian, still is an Australian security officer for one of the security agencies there. Obviously he had clearance high enough to be inside ASIO that day, because he called me up and said, meet me in the garden at the usual place. I want to tell you something about the break-in today. So when we were alone there in Perth in the daytime in the garden that day, later in the afternoon, he says to me, you read about the break-in and the fire. Yeah, he says, well, what you didn't know was that there was a man killed. He did break in. He got to the file room and he was shot dead with your file in his hands that we had there. And we kept the file, but we lost the burglary. We killed him. Now, that made me feel pretty terrible that whatever was in my files were somebody getting killed for, but that's the tale. And remember I told you earlier that I had shelter there in WA from the CIB ASIO guys that were there because they were friendly to my point of view, I guess, and sheltered me from the Eastern States guys. So whether the story is true or not, I don't know, but it seemed like it was, because I know this agent, the karate guy, quite well. And I certainly wouldn't want to cross his path being an enemy. In the intervening years, I have made some friends here in the United States. One such friend lives in Arizona, a businessman who has had contacts clear to the White House and the energy program, very responsible corporate executive. He took my plight, my situation down there to heart, and did everything he could to make life easier and better and to get my story out. I don't intend to name him here, but I'm just telling you that the press, when push comes to shove, I could introduce you to the man and tell you his name and all the details that were necessary in a court of law. He sat at a breakfast meeting in Arizona one morning with Edward Teller on his left, Dr. Edward Teller. He knew he was going to be at this meeting with Dr. Teller because my friend had been asked to, I think, give the morning devotional that they give before their men's meeting there, and so he said he knew he'd be sitting next to Teller on the guest table. So my friend said to me, look, I'm going to take a copy of your book in with me, and I'm going to ask Teller if he remembers you. I said, gee, that'd be great. Let's see what he says. So my friend was sitting next to him, and the devotion came and went, and they were eating breakfast and finished, and so it was a bit relaxed, and he was sitting next to Dr. Teller, and he says, Dr. Teller says, do you know a guy named Stan Deyo that lives down in Australia? And Dr. Teller says, no, never heard of it. He said, that's odd, because he has this book he's written with a letter from Dr. Maxfield on your behalf telling what he'd been doing research for you guys. And when he pulled out my Cosmic Conspiracy book, he said Dr. Teller's face went absolutely drained of blood white, and he didn't answer. And he looked up, Dr. Teller looked up across the table, and several chairs and tables away, and here was an Army general. And the general came immediately over to Dr. Teller and said, look, I'm sorry, we can't leave Dr. Teller here any longer. He's got another appointment, he's got to go, and drug him off. So you can make what you will of that. It does appear that when the hard evidence was put in front of Dr. Teller that he did panic. I don't know whether he had a military minder or whether the military chap was responding to Dr. Teller's silent cue, come get me out of this, I'm surrounded by a nut, or what. But anyway, that's as close as I've ever been able to get to getting Teller to admit that we were connected, other than the letter that Dr. Maxfield wrote, which is photocopies of it in the back of my books. It is interesting to note that every one of the names I've mentioned on this tape, as far as I can recall, has been published in my books. I have never ever received a threat, legally or otherwise, from any of these people. In fact, a number of these people have just very quietly disappeared from the phone books in the towns where they lived and whatever, except for Dr. Maxfield. So it is not a thing that I would be sued over. They don't have enough fear of what I've said or anger or whatever to come and sue. So there must be a little bit of truth in what I've said. As far as I'm concerned, it's 100%. But what I'm trying to tell you is it's odd that after, 22 years of being in print, this book naming all these names, I've never ever been asked to retract or take any of it out or cease and desist or anything by those that I've named. Over the years, there have been phone calls that were a little bit disturbing to the family, but usually only during times when I was preparing like a documentary once that we did in the States, or when I was about to make a public disclosure. Now, what is a matter of public record is that I brought down to Australia, I brought John Schuessler, who used to work for McDonnell Douglas at NASA in Houston. John's job was the head of an engineering team of several hundred engineers, and he was the space flight operations director for the space shuttle program there. John is an avid student of the alleged UFO incidents and reports around the planet. Very rational fellow, as you can tell from his job description. John had collected probably a ton of paper, a room full of paper and documents and photos over the years about the UFO cover-up. Now, you might find that odd for somebody who works at NASA. In fact, he was often the butt of some jokes around the NASA at Houston because of it. Anyway, I met John in the States at NASA when I was there filming a documentary in '83, I think it was. And we got to be friends, and I said to him, look, why don't you come down to Australia and we'll do a lecture tour, let you air your stuff down there if you can't do it here. So he finally agreed, and we set up a national tour of Perth, Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane in Australia. And we had 3,000 people at our first gathering in Perth, and the unions went on strike just before we were fixing to go on stage, and I had to solve a union dispute to get the lights turned on and the power turned on in the hall. A number of things started to happen as we traveled across the country. A heckler guy called the radio station and tried to imply that John Schuessler had no credentials, no degrees, and didn't work at NASA, which was, of course, obviously a fabrication because he was publicly known to do so. The same fellow, we think, dropped a little doll in our lecture in Melbourne on that same tour. In the front row, he dropped it out of a bag he had, and the doll goes, "Mama," like that, at a critical moment during a very serious topic. Of course, the audience broke into laughter, but it was a way to interrupt or discredit what John and myself were saying at the time. And we started seeing the signs. John said, I recognize the technique. This is from the States. These guys are not locals. They've been flown in. And so we then flew up to Sydney for the lecture we were going to do there. At about 2 o'clock in the morning in a hotel room, John got a call from a meeting of 3 agencies of the United States. NASA was represented, Donald Douglas represented the United States Air Force, and I think there might have even been DOD, I'm not sure, but at least those three were at the meeting, and they told John on the phone that he had a job and a family at home, and home's where he should be right now. If he wanted to stay that way, he'd get on the next plane home and just be quiet. He was embarrassing NASA and the government by talking about what he was talking about. Well, within an hour of that, John developed, in fact, this even 30 minutes after that, a bleeding intestinal problem, and was so ill that we had to put him on a plane anyway and send him home. It was several months before he healed from that. I finished his lecture tour with his notes, but that was a threat, and it was certainly a very significant threat from people that he worked for at McDonnell Douglas and NASA and the Air Force. We were told that if we went to the press with that, and the press were all over our hotel trying to get us at that moment, that, and I don't know how they got wind of it, but if the press got wind of it, that he definitely would not have a job at the Cape or at Houston NASA when he got back. Now John has since retired, so I'm relatively comfortable telling you this, so it's not going to affect his job. But for all that time in between, we kept this from the press and the public because it would have meant his job and possibly something else. He's a good friend, and I certainly would not do anything to harm him or his family, so I'm sure that he could tell you a lot more of the details that happened to him after he got back, because he got an instant lateral promotion when he got back anyway. But there are tales like this, things that have happened along the way where people have suffered a great deal to get a little information out to the public and then it gets swallowed up. The media is an odd thing. It can really hide a story or twist it till it's unbelievable. Now we'll probably discuss, or we will discuss some things that I'm familiar with, some technologies that I know work and have developed myself as well. A lot of talk was floating around the United States and Australia and the Western world back in the Reagan administration about a death ray. Well, I actually talked to one of the guys that was on a test of a naval vessel, U.S. naval vessel that was down in Australian waters off the Adelaide coast or South Australian coast in the early 70s, which used one of these so-called death rays to knock out what's called a Gendevic target aircraft drone from 5 miles away. Let me explain this weapon. The comic book writers and cartoonists have often spoken of a laser cannon or laser gun that you point at some object and you vaporize it from a long way away. The problem is that there are a couple of problems with a laser that punches through the atmosphere and hits a target and then vaporizes it. If you hit a metal object here on the surface with a laser beam that is of the frequency and energy to actually melt the metal rapidly, what happens is a mirror surface forms there. It's called the plume effect. And at somewhere around 80% of the energy of that laser beam, as it strikes the target and forms a mirror, is reflected away. And so it doesn't get it as hot as it should. And so you track down the target. You have little pits of mirror surfaces as it moves along because it reflects heats like this, and it doesn't rip the target apart. So they devised a way to make a laser beam that would ionize or excite nitrogen in the atmosphere. When the gas of the atmosphere becomes ionized, and nitrogen had 3 or 4 levels of ionizations you could use, I think it's 4, something like that, the nitrogen can conduct electricity. And most gases can if they're in a plasma state. So they wanted this laser beam to go to the target, making a wire in the atmosphere of the ionized gas. And over the surrounding that laser ionized channel was going to be pulses of donut-shaped or smoke ring-shaped charged gas at high temperature. Now, these donut shapes spin like that, forward in the center and curling around the back, just like a breaststroking donut going along this laser beam to the target. And the idea behind it was that they would send a lot of these high voltage, high current plasma rings along this wire to the target, which is just a laser beam, so that when it got to the target, it would scoop out the metal that melted and throw it to the side so it couldn't reflect the beam away, and it could tunnel right in and cut a hole in the craft, which it did. It was quite effective. The cameras to photograph the test of the firing of it on the naval vessel had to operate at 50,000 frames a second to capture the toroids leaving the cannon. So we did have that, and it was being shared down in Australia at that time. I'm familiar with the technique, but the same technique can also be used. Instead of making a weapon, you can make, with a minor adjustment to the whole thing, you can make an antenna that goes from the ground out as far as you want, and you can transmit and receive data along this ionized channel in the atmosphere, and it's a portable antenna that can be 2 miles long if you want, straight up or straight out. There are a lot of peaceful applications for it, but unfortunately because of war and what other things, it had to be classified. So we do have that, and I am aware of that one, and I'm planning to use some of that myself in a peaceful application rather than for weaponry. The concept of toroids is a fundamental thing that has been left out of our physics books for the main part until the last 10 years. I have seen that the University of Texas, or University of Houston, I think it is, anyway, in Texas, I think it's in Houston, there has been work in aerodynamics utilizing what I'm about to explain to you. I have no problem explaining this to you because having built craft using what I'm about to tell you, I know there are two factors that you don't know about until you build one that will not compromise my patent at this point. It will not enable you to build one yourself without a lot of heartache. But the concept, I will tell you. Asymmetric propulsion is completely opposite to symmetric propulsion. Symmetric propulsion is where you have thrust reaction. The Newtonian value of where you have a rocket, it shoots gas plume out the back, but it moves the opposite direction. This is a symmetric propulsion. Mass out the back, mass the opposite direction. Asymmetric propulsion is where you can take your object, shoot mass ahead of it, and follow it. You go in the same direction, so it's asymmetric propulsion. My original patents that I filed in Australia were under a thing called a vortical insertion accelerator, or a VIA drive, VIA drive. And that was for marine application of what I'm about to explain to you. Asymmetric propulsion is something you see in life quite frequently and never pay any attention to it. Every time you've seen a bumblebee flying, you've seen asymmetric propulsion working. In aerodynamics, they teach in the universities the bumblebee cannot fly, but God forgot to tell him. And the understanding of why and how he can fly is a marvelous piece of understanding of the entire fabric, the basis for what makes the universe run. This is why what I'm about to tell you is more than just propulsion. It is new nuclear physics. It is an understanding of how energy exchanges throughout the universe in multiple parallel universes even, as Einstein did postulate. When you have been in the garden watering with a water hose, and you've been tired of watering, and you stuck the water hose on spray down into the soil, especially if you had sandy soil, when you've stuck it into the ground, you've noticed, I'm sure, that occasionally it will tunnel itself into the ground. You get it just under the dirt, get a little bit of mush around it, and your water hose head sucks itself into the ground. What you may not have done is take a big bucket of water and take this water hose and the nozzle, hold the hose maybe 2 feet away from the nozzle so that there's a lot of leverage on that nozzle, and turn it on spray, and it's dancing around like this. The nozzle, you're dancing around, you think, wow, it's like a rocket. It's shooting water out here and it's bouncing the head up here. Now, in my bucket of water, if I just let the nozzle on spray get right under the surface, right there, just as it clears the surface, it sucks itself to the bottom, like a rocket in reverse. And you say to yourself, wow, that's neat, why did that happen? So then you look at standard physics and you say, well, the flow of water created a Bernoulli or a Venturi effect underneath it, and it sucked itself toward the bottom. Well, you would be correct. You think, well, that's novel, but what good is that for propelling something? Because you don't have a bucket wall ahead of you to fly with. But you do. If you've ever been in the boats doing 15, 20, 30 knots, put your hand out into the water, what do you feel? It rips your hand off. It's hard. Inertia forms a wall. So there is a way to generate a hard wall ahead of a craft and use that to create an entrainment, a breaststroking, so that when you pulse that spray of water ahead of you, or spray of air, or spray of electromagnetic field, As you pulse it in thin film, it comes back around and into your intakes of your prime mover and recirculates. Over a period of seconds, your wake is recirculated, approximately 75 to 80% of it, back into your intakes. So your power requirement drops to 20 to 25% to get the same velocity, same speed. Using this, you save energy, you can go a lot faster because you are not shoving your way through the media. In Einstein's view of relativity, in Michelson-Morley's observations of the change in the velocity of light, and in the Lorentz-Fitzgerald transforms that try to explain foreshortening of mass and time dilations because of the observations of Michelson-Morley, there was a mistake, and it's a very simple one. These things I'm telling you are all found in the back of my first book, The Cosmic Conspiracy. I lay out where the information is available in Dr. Sciama's book, The Physical Foundations of General Relativity, and I explain where the error occurred in Einstein's observation as well as Michelson-Morley. And Michelson-Morley did correct this in 1925 in what's called a rotational analog of their experiment. All of these things, from one simple error, we grew a tree of physics that limited us. We couldn't go faster than velocity of light. We had trouble breaking the sound barrier because of the inertial waveforms that breaks the craft, and the extreme, huge amount of power required to go faster and faster than the speed of sound. The error occurred like this. Here's a cup of tea or coffee. You spin it, you stir it. It has tea leaves in it. Now if you imagine that the center of the cup, where it's spinning, the little vortex, is the sun, and that out here around it, spinning around it, are tea leaves, are planets. Then you have the situation that Michelson and Morley were in when they said, look, we're going to shoot some light out ahead of the Earth as it travels along, as split a light beam, so half of it goes this way and half of it goes out at right angles. And so when it comes back, this beam here, as we're moving, will have traveled a long triangle like this, where this one will have traveled a shorter distance, and they should come back out of phase. Well, it didn't happen. They were expecting to sit on their tea leaf, the Earth, and since we were obviously moving through the tea as we orbited the sun, that they would be able to get some change in the velocity of light sideways versus going forward. They found none. As many times as they did the experiment, they found none. Now, their premise was flawed. They were saying we are moving through the fluid of space. They did not consider the fact that the tea was moving us, and we were moving at the same speed of the tea in our vicinity. So, when they discovered this later, Michelson and Gale and Michelson and Sagnac later, they made a spinning disk, and they split the light beam going with the spin of the disk and against it. And they found such a tremendous evidence of light variation, light speed variation, that they were able to navigate a battleship from beneath, from the midships, from beneath deck, without any outside like horizon or any message of telling where the battleship was. They could navigate that battleship by the interference rings that were forming on the go return of the light in a rotational analog. Now what this means is this. You've got your water hose that's spraying water out like this and it curls. If you are not shoving your way through water, air, or any field, then you're generating a definition of, say, like in physics, of like a gamma ray, a gamma photon, or a tachyon, if you go faster than the wave velocity of the medium you're in. Because you are not shoving up this huge inertial wave, which you do when you shove a rocket or something forward, because you're not shoving out part of your inertia in a curl that comes back at you, because you're shoving it behind you, sideways, you create a definition of a low pressure area in front of you, a high pressure area behind you, and your entire craft becomes like a wing, except the whole top surface or forward surface is your lift or negative pressure area, and the back of it is your positive pressure area. It's like the old mail chute devices they used to have, 50 years ago in offices, where you'd open up a chute and put the little bullet with your message in it and suck it up the tube and somewhere else into the building. In front of it is a vacuum, behind it is normal air pressure, so it shoves and pushes it along. Now, I've made a number of videotapes and tests in a laboratory with oil vapor and high-speed smoke ring cannons to explain this to other folks, to explain what's happening when we're building something. The faster you spin or pulse air into a smoke ring, get it off with your water hose now, and just pulse air or water into a donut. The the faster you do that, the more defined that object becomes as a solid. We've been able to shoot these toroids in air and in water to create them and shoot them at up to 100 miles an hour, and they will bounce off of solid objects. They become like a particle, which is why in physics we have evidence for wave behavior at the subatomic level and particle behavior. In essence, there are no solid particles. There are only fluids or inertia spins in a fluid space medium. You can call it whatever you want to, ether space or fine structure, but it is still treated as a medium in which there are vortices, balanced pairs, imbalanced pairs, where you get photon movement or travel in the thing. And if you build, in essence, a large imbalanced vortex, like a donut, then you have the mechanism for a flying saucer or a super submarine or electrogravity craft. Gravity itself does not exist on any system or in any system without spin about a moment. You will not have a gravitational constant without spin. You can estimate the gravitational constant very closely of far stars, distant stars, by the oblateness of their spheroid. Instead of being a perfect sphere, they flatten, and that flattening tells us the angular velocity of the star, and we can determine from that, by the 6th power, I believe, what the gravitational constant is, because it will not have gravity without spin. On a nuclear level, the mass here and the mass in my hand, they do have an attraction, but it's the sum of all the little molecular spins, and there is a net force there because of that in the field of the Earth that we're in. You can have anti-gravity, if you wish to call it that, by generating electromagnetic fields at lower frequencies under a kilohertz, and by overlapping two flat coils and pulsing them so that you generate what Michael Faraday was looking for in the beginning, which was a magnetic capacitor. A static capacitor, a voltage capacitor, can be static because voltage is a potential rather than a traveling current. To have the equivalent of a magnetic capacitor, you have to have a dynamic circuit, which means you build something that stacks, and it is a dynamic storage, like rings or shells of inertia which pass through this coil and then through that one, and they're interfaced by a parametric buffer. So you pulse into this one, and just as you're pulsing into that one, it stops. You pulse into this one, which is carrying the last current you pulse plus the one you've got, and you can stack up a huge field. And our average 30-foot diameter craft would generate a field that went out 800 feet. To generate movement in a gravitational field like that, you have to have spin in your craft or in your field of the craft. And that's where the vortex comes in. You spin the whole lot in like that and around like that. So your donut doesn't just spin like that, it spins this way as well. Once you do that, it's a slight slip in the phase between the two, and you can bend inertia. You can do it with a gyroscope, a couple of gyroscopes, one out on a stick and another on the edge of it, and you can get the same effect where it weighs less, but it's because of the spin. You're just diverting the inertia of the fluid that drives all the mass together. Gravity does not have a one-directional force, say like on the Earth. If you were to drill a hole to the center of the Earth and drop a rock from the surface, it would not go down to the center. It would go down a few hundred miles and hit an inertial shell, a null shell. It would drop through it and bounce back and come to a point where there is a zero inertial gravitational force, because there are shells of gravity, as far as we can discover in everything. Does that make sense, guys? Mm-hmm. Take the case of the bumblebee. I did mention that. Let me explain how the bumblebee works. The bumblebee aerodynamically is a disaster. It's not streamlined. It's got drag problems everywhere. It's bulky. It's clumsy. You watch a bumblebee. Next time you see a bumblebee, sit and watch that guy take off. He'll leap out a bit, spin his wings. He just leaps a bit and spins his wings, and he forms a ball of air around him. And he moves by changing the direction of that ball of air. He recirculates part of his wake. He articulates his wings like this and spins a wake around him, this ball of air that has a low pressure definition in the direction he wants to go. They are clumsy because as they come along and decide, I'm going to land here, they say, well, I got to break the bubble now. So when they go to break the bubble, they crash, and you'll see the bumblebees crash land. That's why they have to break the envelope before they can land. They aren't streamlined. Do you understand what I'm saying now? The secrets are there. They're everywhere in nature. Take the salmon. Oh, the salmon swimming upstream. If you've ever watched that closely, you've thought, how can a salmon swim not only upstream, but up a waterfall and over it? Short waterfalls, they can go straight vertical and over them. Now, they have found that the way they do that is by opening their mouth and their gill structure and forming a vortex which helps them get over the hump. They use the flow of the water. You can tack into the wind at 180 degrees. You understand what I'm saying? You can tack straight into the wind, not at an angle, straight in if you use an entrainment device like we're talking about. And the salmon has one, that God put there. He can do it with his gills and his mouth. And his tail and his fins. He does all that. But he doesn't have enough energy without taking the energy of the waterfall to curl in there and form that vortex. Watch it, read it. The salmon is a mystery, but it is there. It's just an amazing thing. With there's just so many things. With the concept of toroids, these spinning donuts, you can make changes in nuclear chemistry. Instead of say having fission or fusion reactions where you break atoms apart or where you mash them together and shoot things spinning off like that, conceptually there's a way to slow down the spin or to interface to the spin that creates the particle and wind energy out of them at a discrete rate. And in essence what you do is like the alchemist's dream, is you transmute an element down to lower energy elements by strip mining the energy from it. But this would require frequencies like probably in the 40 gigahertz range and tune cavity things too, to actually strip mine the energy by peeling it off like an onion skin. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So there's a heap of things that can be developed from just the simple concept of knowing what a torus is and how it affects subatomic physics. Take a tachyon. Now, Cherenkov, the Russian physicist, said that the blue light coming out of the water in the nuclear piles, the nuclear reactors, that blue light is called Cherenkov radiation. And he put forward the theory that, or the hypothesis, that there were hyperlight particles being produced in the water by the nuclear reactions, and that as they went hyperlight this way, that the shock wave at right angles was Cherenkov radiation, light, blue light. Well, in our experiments with smoke rings in a lab, we did something that verified in our mind that what he said was absolutely correct. You can go many times faster than the speed of light, warp space if you wish, by bending it. We did experiments like this. We put a candle 16 feet away and light it over there at right angles to us, say about 10 feet ahead of us. And we have our target impact area for our smoke ring cannon we built. And we would fire that smoke ring cannon, bang, to go hit the target over there. And 40, 50 feet away, knock something over. As it passed, only as it passed that candle at right angles, the candle flame would do this. It would suck toward the path of the toroid and back. There was a right angle shockwave that went with it, bang, like that. And the only evidence of that smoke ring passing was a shell, a tube of smoke that unraveled behind it. And so then we had to do high-speed photography, dissect the smoke ring, see what everybody else had done in researching this. And you see that there is inside the smoke ring, as it's moving that way, and this would be the center of it, that the incoming air combines here and comes back in and forms a loop, a filament down here like this, to the very center where it forms like a yin-yang, or yin-yang, was it one of those, the Chinese life symbol. It forms one of those where the actual incoming air from ahead of you chases the smoke back out in between, and so it leaves a smoke trail here, which you started with. The smoke ring disappears. We notice it disappears halfway to the target. You can't see it because it's got a refresh of air. It's a warp in the atmosphere, or in the air, or whatever medium. It's a warp that takes the energy and exchanges what was in the smoke ring plus what it goes through. So it's like in a carpet where you put a ripple in the carpet doesn't go anywhere, but the ripple does. And that's one kind of toroid. There's another which is a dynamic one, which is constantly being pulsed and refreshed, and it doesn't have the layers. It does a different thing. But all these things change our whole view of physics and how we can get stuff out of it, how we put things into it, and energy. Energy. Everybody's been looking for that 0-point energy you're talking about. Call it whatever you want to. What happens at a molecular level is there's a lot of little spinning gyroscopes, balanced, imbalanced, photons, which are half of a gyroscope going that way. There's not a balanced torus there. This is chaotic, random motion. And if you take the example of a yacht on a lake, this is a special lake in let's say a volcanic area with hills around it. And there are odd breezes that will blow from here for 5-10 seconds and then stop, and another one from over here. Peculiar wind structure, but breezes come from all directions at odd times, random breezes, and you want to raise your sail to catch those breezes to move you in a particular direction on that lake. Well, you're clever. You've got a little infrared scope that lets you look ahead of the breeze and say, here comes a wave front, I can see by the thermal barrier on it, it's heading our way. Set the sail, grab that bugger, right, got him, and take the energy, drop the sails. Where's the next one coming? There he is over there. So if you can selectively grab wind or energy coming your way at a molecular level, random particles, and vector that energy into a single course, then you can do what Maxwell was talking about, and you can get the fast particles over this side, the slow particles over that side of the little Maxwell's Demon Gateway. You can store that. You can move in a vector that way, and that's what thermionic conversion is you take random motion of mass molecules, preferably in the infrared range for the chemicals that we would use, and you take that randomness, and every time that randomness in a snapshot of a second hits some electric particles that are in a fixed pathway, an oscillation here in a circuit, every time they hit that way and add energy to the particles going this way, that extra energy on the electron is then expressed as a voltage gradient, which you siphon off with a diode and an arc gap perhaps, or at least a diode. And when you do that, you take energy of motion out of the mass over, you cool it in essence by the lost energy that converted to electricity. When it says I want some back, the circuit says I can't do that because my diode won't let me take the energy back. But I'll sure take anything you've got coming my way. So every 40 millionth of a second or so, as these things are vibrating, a certain percentage of that population is striking your plate, thermally, motion-wise. And that motion added on to the moving electron is what you convert as electricity. And if you do that, you can then power your flying saucer, you can power your car. The car goes along with using one of these if you built one. The top of the car, the bottom, the side, something will be taking heat out of the environment, converting it to electricity, which is then put into your wheels. As it goes down the road, the friction generates heat right behind you to put the heat back, and in the air from the resistance of the wires you're using in your motors. So in essence, you pump energy that's normally coming from the sun or some other heat source and flowing somewhere else. You interrupt that flow and say, look, flow through me and turn my wheels. I'll give you the energy back in heat. And so your net balance on the environment is zero. You like it?
I like it.
I'm going to build one of those.
Okay.
Do you understand? For 30 years, I've been kind of in exile down there in Australia because of all this crud where they tried to just get me out of the country. I think that Teller and Maxfield came to me not because I had any ideas that were new and wonderful. They came to me because they were afraid that I would start patenting these things and getting backers in the United States, and suddenly America would know about the new technology, would compromise the overall game plan that they had. And as far as I've been able to deduce, here's what the game plan is. You want to hear that?
Sure.
Okay. Sometime back around 1948-49, a group of men in Europe and the United States and England decided that we couldn't afford another war. Globally, it would be a disaster. But that we had to have a global government of some sort. Because if we kept having diverse economies and resource distribution and certainly uncontrolled birth rates in certain countries, that we were going to overpopulate ourselves and die. To preserve the planet, they said we had to have a world government, a world economy. Everything had to be globally managed. In the States, Dr. Gordon Gray, the man who set up the Cyber Warfare Division of the CIA in the early 50s, was one of these men. Now, I was able to determine that he knew about this thing because he was friends with Agnew H. Bonson, Agnew Hunter Bonson in Salem, North Carolina, of the Bonson Company. Now, I was privy to the Bonson Company's files, correspondence files for Agnew Bonson. He's now dead. He died in a plane crash in 62, I think it was, 62, 64. Dr. Gray was an advisor to several presidents, including Eisenhower. He was the Secretary of the Army. He set up that Cyber Warfare Division for the CIA. These are all matters of public record. He was a friend of Agnew Bonson's. Agnew Bonson wanted to set up a world government by inventing a flying saucer, an electric flying saucer, keeping it secret from the public, making a fake alien landing, and thereby fooling the masses, more than the governments, but the masses of the world, into thinking that elder brothers from space with no political or no religious alliances had arrived. A clean slate. And then they would propose a world government structure which everyone would follow, because they didn't want the alternate, which would be fighting a superior technology so superior that it was better than any plane, rocket, or gun that we had on Earth. They had reason that we could not negotiate a peace. They had reason we could not force people into peace, because that generates resistance groups like the French did in World War II. So they were going to coerce people with this fake alien landing. Reagan said it, what we need is a landing of little green men. The Prime Minister of Australia, Bob Hawke, said it, what we need is a landing of little green men to bring people together. Now, Agnew Bonson wrote a book. He was a CEO of a Bonson company. He wrote a book in his spare time called The Stars Are Too High. And I think, was it Bantam or Sphere, Booksphere, or somebody like that, published a book. We've got a copy of the book, one of the few remaining. In there, he proposed a Council of 8, which he later called the Council of 12 in his personal notes. So the book, in his book, he had the concept of the Council of 8 and the Council of 12 to make this scientific fake alien landing. And his objective was to collect world leaders and scientists into this paradigm so that they could finance such a project. Now, to put his money where his mouth was, Agnew Bonson then hired Townsend Thomas Brown and set him up with a laboratory, which I did visit after they closed it down and put it under lock and key and concrete and iron doors. But they set up this lab to make flying saucers with high voltage using the Byfield-Brown effect. I have their lab notes, which the Bonson family did allow me to extract, plus about an hour's worth of 8mm film without sound taken in the lab day-to-day tests of the flying saucers that they built there, the small discs and things like that. Now, they didn't solve the problem, but Bonson was trying to impress Edward Teller, who was on his guest list. I found that in the notes that he and Teller talked a couple of times over this and the need for a fake alien landing. Then there was the Bryce and Cecile DeWitt, the mathematician, husband and wife pair, who he set up, Bonson set up a fund for them at, where was it, at North Carolina? Anyway, there's a Bonson Research Institute that is still going today that he funded, he endowed, and they were the ones that were running it. I have a copy of a letter he wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt for help, to Nikita Khrushchev, to Albert Einstein. Agnew Bonson was trying to get them to pull this deception together. Now, his friend, and he was a friend, was Gordon Gray. Now, Gordon Gray either took the idea and ran with it, or was already doing it and just didn't tell Agnew. Now, whether Agnew was let in the loop or not by Dr. Gray, what did happen is that Agnew Bonson went out for a proficiency flight on his single-engine aircraft from an air base there near the home where he'd flown in and out of many times. And he went off, as he went off on the flight, he came over his home and dipped his wings to his two sons who were out in the front yard, dipped his wings and saluted them in essence, and flew off on his proficiency flight, and then came back to that same base and attempted a landing with a full nose tank, which he had warned people consistently never do at this airport because there are power lines stretched across the approach, and if you clip your wheels on the power lines, you'll go down, you'll burn in a ball of flame. He landed at this airport, he hit the wires, and the nose tank was full, and he was consumed in flame and died. Now, was it an accident? I asked the family, what do you think? Oh yeah, it was an accident, but it is unusual that Dad had told everyone else not to do what he did, and he comes back and he dies at the airport in a ball of fire. You can see conspiracy everywhere you want, but it is odd that he published the book that he wrote to foreign heads of state and our own head of state at the time, and our leading scientists, trying to get them to pull together a fake alien landing, and Gordon Gray as an MJ-12 member. I'm reasonably certain, I can't prove that, but he was the initiator of the idea of this fake alien landing. A mini version of this was proposed for the Bay of Pigs invasion, to project the Madonna up in the clouds and drop pamphlets over the Cubans and say, when you see this in the heavens, this sign, then know that you're supposed to support the troops to come in because they're coming to liberate you, to so forth. It never transpired, but it was a mini form, a small form of a global deception in which alien beings would be presented purely as technological devices, appearing like in the movie 4th of July or Independence Day, and or like the movie V, the series V. Somewhere along the line, this went underground very rapidly, and Bonson slipped out of the loop and then died, and his book kind of died with him. It just went very quiet. Townsend Brown I talked to before he died a couple times, and we corresponded. He never succeeded in getting his saucers to work because they were basically static electric charge devices, not dynamic. One of the other fellows that was working, and a brother-in-law of Agnew Bonson, working at the lab at that time, was J. Frank King of Salem, North Carolina as well. And J. Frank patented a polyphase ion accelerator disk, or flying saucer. When he filed the patent in 1962, I believe it was, he was visited at his home by 2 men in suits from the government. He said, who came to him and said, J. Frank, you will cease and desist work on this polyphase saucer craft you have tried to patent until we give you further notice. We've put it under a special classification, and we don't want you to do anything to it or develop it or try to do anything further until we clear it. And he said, well, what will happen if I decide to do it anyway? And he said, if you do, we'll do bad things to you. And that was his quote. J. Frank waited patiently for 6 years, and finally he said, I've had enough, I want to play with my craft. He got a hold of the patents office, and he said, look, your guys came in, or somebody did here, and said, I can't do this. Will you please release this, or get off the pot, I want to do it. And they finally sent him a letter back and says, okay, yes, we'll let you do it, we can have the patent and proceed. He never did any more with it because he'd gotten a little bit older at the time and had other things going with his life and business, and he never was able to complete it. As it was, his device would have been a brute force device and not an entrainment toroidal craft like we ended up building. So it wouldn't have been as efficient. I ran over his numbers, and he'd made a mistake even in his prime mover, the horsepower requirement for it. An easy, simple mistake that was corrected, just maybe he had to have more prime mover power than he had to put into his patent. I had his working notes, which were in his personal effects the family gave me, and that's how I know what he did. That dissertation wasn't in the patent itself. Okay, anyway, so there you see an example. Again, he told me that direct. In fact, he told it to me on camera. I have a video of that somewhere back in Australia, where he told about the 2 guys coming out saying, we'll do bad things to you if you try to work on this patent before we tell you it's clear. Strange enough, I heard the same story from a man in Dallas, in Mesquite, Texas, in 1971, before I myself left the country. I picked up a local newspaper from Mesquite, which is outside Dallas, a little thin, Mesquite Times or something or other. On the front page it had, Joe Blogg's local man invents flying saucer, going to launch it, and scale models of it and showing it on. I looked at it and I thought, gee, how could that work? He's got, the vectors are all wrong, but he says he's going to fly down his barnyard pretty soon. So the guy was only a couple miles away, so I rang him. I said, look, can I come over and have a look at that? Oh yeah, sure, come on over. So I get in the car and I whip over to this guy's house, and sure enough, it's a barn. And I get in the house there, and I'm in my suit because I've been at work, and he says, are you with those other fellows, are you? And I said, what other fellows? The guys who just left. The ones that said that they have to be present for me to test it. I said, no, I'm a different fella. Did I say what department they were with? I thought, well, we'll play this for what it's worth. I said, not from my group. And he said, oh, no, well, they said that because of national security, that when I do test the big one, that I have to tell them they have to be present for the test. I said, well, isn't that interesting? Can I see your device? So I looked at it and I realized that it wouldn't fly, it'd hover. It's a good hovercraft, but it wouldn't fly. And the whole point of that story is that before I could get there on that phone call, they must have seen the same newspaper. There was somebody in suits that come out to him and said, look, call us when you're going to test it, we want to be present. Fascinating, isn't it? Look, I'm sure I'm forgetting heaps of things, but it's been a very busy 30 years. But I do intend to release a lot of this now that I've realized that these guys planning this global deception, they themselves, as Sir John told me, which I didn't tell you, in 73, Sir John down in the Melbourne Club group, at that time revealed to me that some stronger group than them, some bigger, tougher group was moving in and they were losing the fight against them. And I never said alien, but understand this group was multinational, so it had to be something national. And I can only assume it was alien. I've never met an alien to my knowledge anyway. I've certainly heard rumors of them from a number of these intelligence people and things I've told you about in the MI6. And the Roswell event, a very odd little story. I'll tell you this, but it may mean nothing. When I was about 15 in Dallas, outside Dallas in Garland, I think it was, which is close to Fort Worth, the sister city, where there's a SAC base at Carswell. I was visiting with another teenage friend of mine, a third teenager. This is back in 1960, 61. And we were sitting there trying to one-up each other with the best ghost story or the best I done this, super thing story, like young guys do. And this third teenager that I had just been introduced to, living there in Garland, said, well, I've got one that tops everything you guys can top. My dad carried an alien from an alien crash back here to Carswell on an aircraft. And we said, oh yeah, right? He said, no, I'm serious now. I'm not fooling. This is a true story, guys, he says. Dad showed me the little gear thing. It had like 9 divisions. There's apparently these odd number of divisions around the gear structure is very hard to make or tool to get it right or something. I said, well, I don't know why that is. And he said, well, and then Dad showed me this piece of metal that came from the hull, and it was like you could take a knife blade and you could peel off layers of this metal. It wasn't glued together, but it stuck together, and you could peel off layers. So we laughed, and we said, well, that's a good one. You almost got us, but no prize. And time passed, and I forgot this. Till about 3 years ago, I guess, when I was listening to Art Bell on the talkback radio here in America over the internet. And Art Bell is saying, folks, I've just received this parcel in the mail from someone saying he sent me pieces of a crashed aircraft, spacecraft from Roswell, and I don't know whether it's real, but here are the photos. I looked at the photos on the internet and I saw the layered hull. It was like a, I don't know, bismuth, bismuth magnesium, was it, or bismuth and aluminum? Aluminum, aluminum, and bismuth layers. And certainly bismuth has some very unusual electrical properties, which would, you could use layered bismuth and aluminum. But the thing that impressed me most was that the material could be peeled off. It was layers, just like this kid had told me about. And of course, the story of Roswell says that it came out of New Mexico by flight to Carswell Air Force Base. And so, did it happen? Did the father see the aliens like he told his son? Well, it's hearsay. But it's another little piece of the puzzle that maybe fits together. On the thermionic exchange, the cooling effect to generate electricity, there was a young fellow who later became an engineer in New Mexico where that thing came down. He was with a scout troop or something like that, fossicking around the area. His name was Barnett, I think. In a filmed interview that I saw of him, he related that his troop, and like they were kids, and they'd come up next to a flying saucer crash. In the middle of the day, it was hot, and there were some alive and some dead aliens laying around. And one thing that he noticed is he was told to step out of the way as the adult scout leader, whoever was with him, was talking to another one. The young fellow Barnett was over next to the ship, and even though it was hot out in the sun, the ship was cold. And one of the aliens was like laying down, was still alive against the side. And he looked at him and felt vertigo, like he was falling as he looked at this alien, as though he was trying to communicate with him or something by mind. But the thing that impressed me was that the craft was cool on the outside. Thermionically, when you draw the energy out, you form an electric flow, electric sink to a heat source, and it will cool the outside while it's gaining energy. So, to me, that fragment of information from Barnett does support a thermionic power source for these. If you are familiar with the Area 51 story, who was the young fellow that came spilling it all about the sport model stuff? Who came forward here recently, 3 or 4 years ago? Oh, you know his name.
I just saw it the other day.
What's his name? You know the young guy that was taken out from Nevada there, and he built the race cars. He was in the newspapers, and then he saw the sport model super flying saucers out there, and we all tried to figure out whether he was telling a lie or not.
I can't recall.
Out there, you know who this fellow was.
A young guy. You say young guy.
Yeah, well, reasonably young.
Only one I could think was Wendell.
No, not
It was sport.
No. This is he was the darling of the talk radio set for a while there, telling the secrets of Area 51. Anyway, this fellow reckoned that he was shown the UFO, the crashed UFO, and that it used element 115 to power it. And he said that they had a particle beam that would hit this, and it would generate heat, and this heat was then used to generate electricity, and you had to have element 115 or you couldn't do it. Well, that's bull dust. But the part that he described about the thermionics was certainly true as far as I can determine, in that you have to generate that heat source relative to your outside sink so that you can then let the heat flow into electricity to extract it as moving electrons rather than spinning or translating subatomic particles. What is that guy's name? Anyway, so that part of it, again, there's someone else talking about the thermionics in the drive, where they use heat converted to electricity for thermionics. And you're familiar with thermal electricity. I mean, it's been known for a long time. The Russians have probably been the leaders in it, where you get dissimilar metals, put them together, heat the junction here, cool the junction there, electricity flows, or conversely, put electricity into it, and it will cool one junction, heat the other, in the dissimilar metals. Dr. Schrodinger wrote a paper on the possibility of frequencies, wave fronts, being the factor that control the amount of conversion at the junctions of these dissimilar metals, saying that it would be possible to increase the efficiency if the frequency were matched better in the coupling of the metals, and there was an artificial frequency put in there across the gate. Sorry, Heisenberg did that one. I think Heisenberg proposed that, not Schrodinger, Heisenberg. But anyway, all of them are moving toward efficiencies in thermoelectric conversion. So we know that thermal processes in conductors can be made to convert directly to electricity. All we're saying here is that there is a way to extract the energy much more efficiently and much more rapidly using tuned cavity resonators and triboluminescent interfaces to the infrared frequency of molecular motion. You know, it's a natural band. On the previous tape to this, I was trying to remember a guy's name was Bob Lazar, nicknamed Bob Bizarre around our place. But anyway, the story is there, and a lot of the elements he had in his story are correct as far as I know, technologically. It's just that you don't need element 115 to make the energy convert like he's talking about. Okay, now, back to Dr. Gordon Gray. In the Millennium edition of the Cosmic Conspiracy that I wrote, I put a whole section in there about Dr. Gray and where he'd worked, who he'd worked for, and traced his pathway into the involvement in this cover-up or this fake alien landing. As a kind of a joke, or maybe an aside, for a while in the inner circle, as far as I can determine, it was called the Gray Project, meaning Dr. Gray, not the little grays that run around, but eventually we had little gray bodies appear in the lore or the myth with the alien flying saucers. As I say, I have never seen these beings. I don't know whether they're cloned human hybrids of some sort that we genetically engineered ourselves, or whether they really are semi-alien life forms. You get into, into biblical theology and all kinds of things when you explore the origin of these species, but certainly ancient history in the Middle East, Mesopotamian Valley, North Africa, does reflect that we had a race or several races of advanced beings which could have come from a parallel dimension, from stars out there, whatever, but they did interface with mankind, and there were legends that the Greeks preserved and the Romans preserved of marriages or unions, mating unions between these beings and our earth women, which produced the giants or heroes of the ancient legends, you know, like Thor and Heracles or Hercules in the Anglo spelling of it. And we have found evidence in researching books over in the Middle East of advanced cultures in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, and under the Persian Gulf. In fact, in the second book I wrote, The Vindicator Scrolls, I did document where the sunken capital of Atlantis would be in the Persian Gulf. Now, I tell you this story because I do think, as do many other historians and people that dig in the archaeological areas over there, that we did have an advanced culture interface, because we found evidence in Iraq of 100 batteries over there that were clay and copper and iron and acetic acid, and they produced voltage. And so it was such a find that many museums started analyzing their gold artifacts to see if they were gold plated. And this was electroplating long before we thought it possible in the cultures that we'd studied beforehand. Now, in Bahrain, the sheikh in charge of Bahrain kicked out the Western archaeologists when they discovered a more advanced civilization 80 feet beneath the Dilmun digs there, a technologically more advanced civilization than was previously thought possible. To our knowledge, none of whatever they found has been allowed out of the country after they kicked out the Western archaeologists. Jacques Cousteau's people, Captain Darasoff on the Alcyone, and I discussed the location of the capital of Atlantis, which is Poseidon Island, which was thought to be a salt diapier that collapsed close to the shores of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. It's next to a minefield, or an oil field there, to the Berry oil field, and it's called Abu Ali. And down underneath there, we think, is where the sunken headquarters or castle, or of Poseidon's palace is. However, we weren't able to get in there because the Gulf War broke out when we were talking to Cousteau's people, and we couldn't afford to put the Calypso in there because of the bubble mines in the Persian Gulf that might sink it. So that's all advanced civilizations. That's all evidence of a superior culture. The Bible tells about things like that in the Hebrew, the Greek, and the Torah. I am certain that those things are correct and true representations of what happened back then. Where these beings come from, well, I don't think that they are, from what we could determine in the Hebrew writings and the Arabic and Chaldean, they were not simply from another planet. They were from a parallel universe, dimension if you wish, as Einstein correctly predicted. Experiments have been done. I've certainly participated in making some of these coils myself with toroidal coils to try to open up a gateway between our energy density, our universe, and a parallel universe. In fact, there's evidence of at least 6 others, where you make a gateway between us and a parallel world, like you'd open up an energy well, if you wish, into an upper energy density level or to a lower energy density level. To that end, I think the Stargate series, the movie and the series, were quite well informed in that they showed a circular gate like our toroidal coils would be. And I think another series called Sliders showed even a vortex, which is what we would develop in these things. And the crude one that I built worked once and immediately burned out. And in that space of time, as I fired up the coil, it was only about this big, it bent light in the room coming off of doors and walls and stuff. It bent light so that it looked like the whole center of the coil had been on saran wrap or like plastic wrap, and it bent the light of the room in toward that, and it made me feel nauseous, as though I were being pulled into it. But then it burned out, and I could never ever get it to work again. It was just a fluke, and I was pulsing this coil. Another fellow in Australia, in West Australia, at Fremantle, was working with Tesla coils and toroidals, and he showed me his, and he'd run into the same problem. He got it to work once, and it was like a patch over that from the next world. You couldn't get it to work again. You just have to start all over, build a new coil, move to a new location. A few feet away, you can do it again, which is quite time consuming. So we're obviously quite blind in what's going on there, but we know that such things as parallel gating are possible. In the lore of humanity, we have things which discuss ghosts and angels appearing. What we have been able to determine is that the ghosts that appear in the legends, when they do seem to appear legitimately, the room gets cooler. And we think it's because, however they're appearing, is somehow opening a gateway between their energy density universe and ours, and the energy flows out of ours into theirs, which cools our room. On the other hand, the appearance of angels, and from the higher dimensions, are from worlds where the energy density is greater. So when they open up, it floods in, and that's why the reported sightings of God's chariot and Ezekiel and stuff, the sky opened up and boiled, as this light appeared in just out of nowhere on the horizon and came toward them. Would indicate that it's from a higher energy density. And if you read the Hebrew representations of it, it speaks of levels to the universes, which could be up to 7, and at the upper energy density level would be where God is, whatever you want to define God as. But that does tell us that there was an interface with an advanced culture or cultures back at the beginning of mankind. All of these ancient records speak of a time when they will return. All of them speak of the first intercourse, literally intercourse between those beings and our women, as a bad thing. It wasn't supposed to happen. It jumped the genetic lineup, or however, God, the Elohim, had created the earth to be. It jumped that, as though we bred with beings that were superior genetically and we shouldn't have. They are due back now, and warnings have been passed down in numerous religions and philosophies about being careful to choose the good guys from the bad guys. And it's like, I often quote this, there is no Santa Claus. When they do arrive, and there will be an alien encounter with humanity openly, very shortly in my opinion, when they do arrive, the first lot will be handing you lollies, gifts, candies. They will be technologies that we need for healing cancer and balancing the planet and propulsion, things that we think we don't have. Certainly I can tell you positively that we have advanced saucer propulsion and the energy converters, the laser plasma guns, a number of things like this. That I know. I know how they work. I've seen the similarities of some of the things that I haven't even built, but I know that. What I don't know is what happened in 74, 75, 78, somewhere in there, when this other group knocked off the guys, like the Gray group and whatever, took them over. They were afraid of someone moving in, and I suspect that what we have now is a puppet government across the planet of those who survived out of the Gray project, but they're being run by true non-humans, and not just simply extraterrestrials, those guys from the past. And if we can trust the warnings that have filtered down in all the old languages, we are to not be fooled by the first arrival of superior beings, wherever they say they're from. There will be a lie. It's part of a battle going on in a parallel universe to us, that basically we became the virtual reality to resolve that conflict. From the Garden of Eden story to now, it's all been a virtual reality to show what happened in the real universe out there if the law had been allowed to be changed like they wanted to do in the rebellion out there. That's what the old records say in pure, digested, simple English. So all I caution people about is this. We on Earth have had this technology since the mid-50s. We've developed a number of things that are quite advanced, and they were held back simply in an effort to make a peaceful world government. I can understand that now. But that secret group was overthrown by a more powerful group, and I can only assume that it was these guys from the past that are now here again. We have evidence of them all through history, kind of monitoring. Why they waited till then to take it over, I don't know. But it has been set in motion, and I think what we've got now forming as a global government is a tremendous deception. Tremendous deception. And it will go along the lines of, this first group of arrivals will say, we created your messiahs, we created your illusion of God, we created you. But now we're back to help you, we're your friends. We mean you no harm. Don't trust the Trojan horse to start with. That's my only caution, based on all the evidence that I've been able personally to be involved in. We started to try to do a good thing in that Gray project, I'm sure. It got misdirected when the real baddies arrived. There will be, true good guys arrive, if I understand it correctly from the old writings. But the first lot is just like in the movie V. They've got a nice human, nice guy exterior, but they're serpents underneath, they're lizards. They've got a different agenda than what they're telling you. And, that's what I'm going to be telling people when I more so than I have done in the past, about what's about to happen. We've got to be extremely cautious about who we go with. We're going to see this alien encounter. People have been waiting all their lives for it, in the modern generation. You're going to get it. But the trick is going to be to choose the right guys. And they're going to come bearing gifts. They're not going to come as little gray guys that rip you apart. Those can be sacrificed as the bad guys by the imposters. And the imposters will come as spiffed up, nice humans, perhaps a bit taller, a bit prettier, certainly more intelligent. And who would argue with such a thing? They will solve your nuclear war problems. They will solve your disease problems. They will solve your economic disaster that's coming. Not a problem. So this is why we must be very cautious in analyzing the data. I could be totally wrong, but this is the conclusion I have drawn from the peripheral involvement I've had with the project. You got to make up your own mind.
And Fox Mulder.
Fox Mulder. Yeah. Yeah, that's another interesting story.
The tail ends.
Yes. Well, I tell you what, for all the Trekkies out there, that warp business is a really true representation of the way it is, because you bend the inertia around behind you and you're always traveling ahead of a wave and there's always a vacuum. You warp space. And doing it that way, you don't have to suddenly, well, you do have to pulse to start with to get the warp formed. But after that, you can go many times the speed of light. The universe is a lot smaller, when you can exceed that speed. And it's not a limit, it was an observed limit in the region of the test of the Michelson-Morley experiment, the first ones. It's been corrected, but no one's bothered to tell everybody.
Mm-hmm.
We can go many times faster than that. You don't leave a shockwave. Well, except for the lateral displacement.
You talked a little bit about how the craft could make 90-degree turns.
Ah, yes. Well, okay. With an aircraft or a marine craft that operates purely on moving air or water by whatever dynamic force, you have a problem of turning corners, changing your vector very rapidly. Because if you do, you'll break the people inside and eventually you'll break the craft. The structural fatigue will kill you. It's like crashing into a wall. If you turn a corner at right angles at 3,000 miles an hour in a fraction of a second, it hurts a lot. So they had to develop a way to accelerate every atom of the crew and every atom of the craft fairly uniformly. Basically, it is not simultaneous, but it is darn close to it. The idea was to generate one of these vortexual fields of electromagnetic current flowing through the crew and the craft, to generate, like the bumblebee, a dynamic flowing field through everything. When you change the field's vector, like to change the vacuum or the low pressure field in front of you, you change that throughout the entire mass. So it's fairly uniformly accelerated. There are limits to that, but there's such incredibly high speed change limits that you don't worry about it. But to do this, here's what has to happen. It's the same as if you jumped off of a 40-story building without a parachute or anything else. When you landed, the time spent in reducing the vertical component of your velocity to zero is so short that it causes structural fatigue in your body and you die, right? Crash. If you were to make a titanium ball and another titanium ball just slightly smaller with an interface fluid so it could spin inside the other ball, and you were to locate yourself magically inside that against the inside of this titanium ball, and then you were to push that whole lot over the 40-foot building, when it hit, if it did not deform the titanium ball, it could withstand and hold its true spherical shape. Your ball inside that, with the fluid bearing between you and the outer ball, would cause you to spin because you're an asymmetric, or your weight is not evenly distributed. You would spin, just like in the state fair when you go to those spinning barrels. They drop the floor out from under and you hang against the wall. What would happen is you would spend many seconds or minutes reducing your vertical component to zero. Instead of a fraction of a second, you would spin for a while until the heat, the friction dissipated, and then you would have landed intact, wouldn't you? So, in the craft we're talking about, they do this electromagnetically. You can't alter the mass, length, time parts of your equation. You have to give in one area if you take in another. It has to balance the equation. So if you pump energy into the field, and hence the occupants and the craft, to then change a vector at high speed, because you have to dump some energy in there and vector part of your energy to move. If you do that, then something has to give. You're saying to the mass inside the field, we're going to turn a corner here very rapidly. If we did it in an ordinary craft, we would flatten and break. But for you, your body and the craft, your molecules are now, the spin at the molecular level is increased uniformly. And so your mass, in essence, increases as you go around that corner. To you inside the ship, looking out a window, what would happen is you get a call from the captain and say, we're going to do a right angle turn. We're energizing for a right angle turn. Pour a cup of tea, get the cards out, because it's going to take us about 5 minutes to get around the corner. For you, with more mass, time will pass, physical, chemical reaction will pass at a different rate to those outside the field. Everybody outside your window will go into slow motion. To you, or to them looking at you, they will see this bright light coming up at 4, 5, 10,000 miles an hour, turning a right angle and say, bloody impossible. But inside, you will have gone into the higher energy density, the spin rates, on all your molecules, and your craft will too, and you will go around that corner like, oh, yawn. Okay, we're back to real time? Fine. And then you lower your energy density, your light changes. From the ground, you will see it pulse light. That's how it's radiating the extra energy. It's relative time, but based purely on physical chemical reactions. It's like one professor I was arguing with over at the University of West Australia. I said to him, yes, you can have a craft that will suspend, many tons in the air for 10, 15 minutes at a time, stationary. Rubbish, he says. Throws these chocolates red in the face. I said, no, wait. He says you cannot do that. You physically cannot have enough power on board to do that. I said, well, let's take the case of a hot air balloon. No, we can't do that. That's specific gravity. That's not gravity. I said, yeah, but if you could generate that same effect electromagnetically in a bubble around a craft, he could stay there for a long time because it's not going anywhere. You can't do that. You can't do that. I will not listen. Out he went. But it is not specific gravity. It's part of gravity. Even Da Vinci recorded this phenomenon that about gravity is lower density and higher density things being displaced above the other. In his papers, it's there. In his Codex Atlanticus, I think it was. But the blind will just not see. It's an incredible thing. But these craft are like that. The lower energy density in the helium or balloons or the hot air allows the molecules inside there to operate at a different mean velocity and spin to those outside the field. And if you do it electromagnetically, then you can turn your corners. And you can do all these wonderful things where they can dance around your commercial airliners and stop and zip away. If you ever get a chance to see one, you will see light changes in the craft as its energy density changes. You either pump energy into a field or out of it. If you take it out, then you're going to age at a different rate. And there are so many offshoots of that. If you could build a room, which you can, stationary, you can take someone who's critically ill into that room and store them for a number of days or weeks until you can figure out a cure for it, and then bring them out because it will only be a few seconds for them. Or, a great decision in the White House has to be made in the next hour, but we need to analyze too much data, take it into a room that's running on dilated time and live several months inside the field but only a few minutes outside the field. You see what I'm saying? It's relativistic. We can't break the rules of physics. Either the amount of time that the inertia changes has to be changed, or the mass of the inertia has to be changed. If you're going to turn that corner fast, then you have to compromise the time, and you have to take longer to go around that corner, and that's the way you do it. It's relativistic time within the field. That's why you've had reports like down in South America of, what was his name, Gomez or something, one of the Mexican guys down there, they had a saucer go down their area, and his men were all looking for it, and he was looking for it, and he found it. And his men come back together and say, where's Gomez? And, they can't find him, and all of a sudden he comes stumbling out of the dark, out of the paddock there, and, oh, muchachos, hey, and he collapses. When he went in there 15 minutes earlier, he had no beard. He came out with a 5-day growth 15 minutes later, and his watch was forward 5 days. He'd stumbled into the edge of a light, or of a source, and he'd gone into the field gradient, and of course he'd aged.
This is how Jodie Foster did it.
Yes.
They knew what they were talking about.
Oh, of course it did. Of course it did. There's just so much of this I see in the movies. I wonder if someone's feeding it to them because it's right on. I mean, Stargate just really blew me away. I thought, wow. And sliders. Even the device was so close. They all picked the toroid.
As well as a lot of, I've seen the technical journals, and a lot of work being done on toroids. I'm not familiar with any of it. But
Oh, look,
I've
toroids.
I've noticed.
Look, as far back as 1950, 56, 57, Scientific American had an article with photos of a guy who had made 2 little boxes to shoot plasma toroids, plasma rings off of carbon arc things, to shoot them at each other and photograph the collision of these things. And he built an entire universe of galaxies. He said, here's a barred spiral, two colliding toroids. Here's a globular cluster.
Is that Bostic?
Say again?
Is that Bostic's work in Stevens,
I can't remember.
New Jersey?
I can't remember. It's just I just remember the photos. But you see what I'm saying? The barred spirals.
Yeah.
And we could produce every known shape of galaxy from colliding tori at different angles to each other in different spin rates.
Created spiral galaxies.
Yeah.
I know
Just
that.
amazing stuff.
I know that one.
They're
And the other guy that picked it up was, there was an artist, Crockwell. The Crockwell model of the atom was an extension of that, where they showed that it's the spin.
That I'm not familiar.
It was in the same Scientific American. Yeah, sorry.
okay. We've noticed a similarity in the shape between the disk craft and the shape of a universe or of a galaxy.
Yeah.
That's
Well-
probably no coincidence.
No, there's a rule out there. It's just the way the order of things is, and the spiral, the flow. Yeah, I mean, as I told you, you don't have a gravitational constant without spin about a moment somewhere. You've got to have that angular velocity in the field somewhere. And that's how you re-vector. If you're in another field and you want to be anti-gravity or bend it, you've got to take the moment from that gravitational field and divert it so that it gives you motion laterally. Okay, one thing that I forgot to clarify was about the Gray group. I told you how they were overthrown apparently by some strong group from 74 onward, 74 to 78 somewhere. They themselves, the Gray group, put a lid on electrogravitic or anti-gravity research in 1958 in May. Now, the reason I can pick that fairly closely is that the New York Herald Tribune ran a series of articles, which I have reproduced from the microfilm that I got from the remaining records of the New York Herald Tribune at that time. It was 1955, they produced stuff that showed me that there were over 100 companies and universities in Japan, United States, Canada, Europe, working on electrogravitic propulsion. Glenn L. Martin Company, Chapel Hill was mentioned. It was not a company, but Chapel Hill over in the eastern United States. I'm just trying to remember. Anyway, a number of companies that are today leading names in aerospace were actively involved and openly discussing work in disk and electromagnetic propulsion. In May of 1958, the electrostatic journals, I forget what the association's called, had been talking and discussing these things up till May 1958. But after May 1958, no more public papers were presented in the trade literature or anywhere that we could find on what these companies and universities had been researching electrogravitics. There was a clampdown because they didn't publish papers and said, look, don't chase electrogravitics anymore, it's a dead end, it won't work. They just stopped saying anything about it. And there were so many big name companies and big name governments working at the time publicly in the New York Herald Tribune articles by name that you know that they continued. But it was siphoned off, and that's another point. People have asked, how could money for flying discs and all this stuff, how could money have materialized? You're talking billions and billions of dollars. The next time someone tells you that you have paid for a $500 cedar hammer or something, understand that all of the money that you pay to space research may go to space research, but it goes to private corporations and multinational corporations who put a bid in to make something for NASA or the government. It goes to space research, it doesn't necessarily go to crude ballistic missiles. I have more respect for the astronauts than most of you know that they sat on top of a tin full of explosives that was made by the lowest bidder, every one of those million they sat on, and blast them into orbit. And they knew how flimsy it was. The money did not go all of it into making crude chemical space shuttles. I met with Dr. Henry Pohl, propulsion engineer and co-worker with at Houston. And Pohl said to me, do you see that space shuttle, those big nozzles, the engines on the back? He said, did you know that just the fuel pump, to pump the fuel into them, is 150,000 horsepower just for the fuel pump?
And we talk about these main engines here. There's 3 of them on that vehicle. Those things are a little deceiving when you look at them, but you have to realize that it takes about 150,000 horsepower to drive the fuel pumps that pump the fuel into the combustion chamber or into the rocket fuel pump. That's just to drive the fuel pump. Well, the thing that we need now is we need a breakthrough in a new concept in propulsion. That when we talk about chemical propulsion, we've stretched it just about as far as we can. We've always thought that the major advances to mankind came out of war. But what we need is an anti-gravitational device or something like that. I look at the pyramids, for example, and I am not convinced that we did not at that time have some type of anti-gravitational device that assisted those people in putting those huge stones in place. I think it was possible then. I think it is possible in the future that we will come up with some technique that can allow us to lift enormous masses with very little force and an expenditure of very little energy.
I know he knows, a lot of us know, but now then the ones that were part of the original group can't talk, they're trapped. I think Tilden and the rest of them are trapped. There's a bigger minder on them than what we had ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think America, oh, that's something. America is going to be taken down hard. They're through with this. They're throwing us away. We were a technological source to get it up to a level, to get what they needed to take it out of the country. Our technology has gone to Europe, to various other bases underground they've got. They're going to sacrifice America because we're too vocal. We won't stand for this kind of nonsense once we know about it. They're going to take us down. You watch it. They're going to hit us with bio warfare, internal strife, a lot. And we are going to lose this country. Well, most of it anyway. It is very short. And this is, well, Holly and I have come back. We know what's going to happen. And we've come back to try to help as many as we can get through it. At least understand what's happening so they can take appropriate action.
You'd mentioned something about Lockheed Martin had developed a particular craft when we talked on the phone yesterday. You were asking if I knew about the craft that Lockheed Martin made.
Was it Lockheed Martin or was it about Avro in Canada?
Well, maybe we were.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember. I'll tell you an interesting story. Most people now have seen. We did the first releases of it. The film of the Avro car, the Avro disc, the AV row flying saucer. I think the United States Army bought the first rights. The U.S. bought into that in '62 or something like that. That was Frost Project, F-R-O-S-T. I got film footage from Fort Eustis and got them to declassify the section that I used, and we showed it around many years ago. The mistake they made with the Avro disc was they had turbines in the middle, and it was Blackburn Aero, it was AV Row, Blackburn Aero, and McDonnell Douglas, not Lockheed. But McDonnell Douglas bought up Blackburn, which bought up AV Row, and that's the chain of how it went into the United States. But their flying disc had a big turbine in the middle. It was a tip-driven turbine. It was on a freewheel, and they had 3 JT-69 Pratt & Whitney engines that shot exhaust onto it to spin it like that. And it would suck air down in the center of the saucer shape and out through cowlings that then focused it underneath. They were supposed to get 10,000 feet altitude and 300 to 400 miles an hour with it as a tactical 2-man aircraft. They couldn't clear the ground. Same problem that the Germans had with the V1 and in the beginning the V2. Ground effect got them. If they had turned the Avro car upside down, it would have flown a lot better and taken the cowlings off. They were that close. That's why they abandoned the project. So why whip a dead horse? Build it to upside down to start with. Instead of sucking the air in the top and blowing it out the bottom and here and forming this cushion, this tremendous ground effect cushion which sucks you to the ground, they couldn't get clear of it. The more power they put in it, they sucked themselves down. We've got them going through the snow with that thing, or over the surface of the snow, and you can see the curl, the drag curls coming up like that and sitting right on top of it. They couldn't lift off. Their own weight was killing them. The Germans, V2s, V1s. In the beginning, the captured footage we got of the test, their V1 would go, you know, and fall over.
And have it setting down fairly close to the earth. The rocket plume, the exhaust gases, when it came out, would have a tendency to come back up and put forces on the vehicle, and the vehicle was marginally stable at best at low velocities. And frequently those forces would topple it over, or you would get a cavitation on one side of the nozzle. The thrust would decrease on that side, and that would put an unsymmetrical force on the vehicle and tend to tilt the vehicle.
Till they realized, hey, we're blasting all this supersonic exhaust out here. It's hitting the ground, which is flat like your water hose in a bucket, and it's curling around onto the rocket, making unstable forces on it, knocks it over, destabilizes the gyros, we're done. Dr. Pohl knew about the same thing. We talked about it, we had a laugh about it, because until you vent, like they do it at the Cape, till you vent the exhaust out through a pipe and away over to a lake somewhere, get them out of the way, they'll hold you down. That's just your own inertial waste coming back as a wave and holding you down, or destabilizing your gyros. So they had the same problem with the AV road disc, the Avro disc. And we laughed, because if they'd have just turned it upside down, it would have worked fine. Amazing, isn't it? Yeah. So many other things. So many other things.
Do you have any direct knowledge of any of the human-built craft that are operational?
Look, I never got to ride in one or see one other than the photos that I told you about in the Polaroids. I was on the periphery of the project only because I was a danger, because I was an entrepreneur down there in Texas wanting to take his ideas and build planes and make an industry. They had to either kill me or move me south and out of the way. And to my benefit, they decided on the latter, to move me south and keep me out of the way. If they hadn't done that, you wouldn't even hear what you're hearing today, obviously. But Sir John and Sir Henry, I think they knew they were going down, and I think they moved me out of their records. That's why they cleaned their office out of all of my stuff, so there's no paper trail to me when they got taken over. It took me a while to figure out why they just sent everything back. They got rid of it as quick as they could and said, run. Really, that's what it amounts to, and they probably saved my backside from this other group, whoever they are. And I think a long time after that, when Teller was at that breakfast with my friend, and he went pale when the friend says, I know you know him, because here's the letter. Yeah. I think from that he was controlled. Teller himself is under control now. And I hold no malice toward these people. I understand why they did what they were doing. It failed. They didn't count on the real guys. But now we're here where we are, and we have to make a lot of preparation very quickly. And people have to be warned of their options. You have to be able to know the options. I think in America there will be very few people to take choices, but for the rest of the world, they got our knowledge base on all this. They will be prime victims for what is coming. And there's not much you can do except share the information you got, show people how it works as quickly as possible, and say, look, make up your own mind, but here's what's the problem. As soon as America goes down, people in the world are going to be left without a leading nation. And that's when the imposter, I think, of deception will start. They'll take over and take our place. They've finished with us. They're going to throw us away. Amazing, isn't it?